Chapter 829. No matter how accustomed Feng Ling was to being with a group of men, she was really not used to it right now. Li Nanheng was really tired and soon fell asleep again. The man's steady breathing was by her ear. She put one hand on herself and the other hand clenched the bed sheet under her. She stared at the ceiling of the ward under the dim night light and glanced sideways at the man who was sleeping soundly. It wasn't that she hadn't had close contact with him before. At least a few years ago, when Li Nanheng tested her personally, the two of them had restrained each other for a while because of close combat. At that time, the distance between them was very close, but the atmosphere at that time was different from now. At that time, it was the sweat and fighting on the training ground and her pride. But now, in such a quiet space, she felt a man lying next to her without any distracting thoughts. His breath was less than 10 centimeters away from her ears, and she could even feel the obvious gap between the man and the man she was pretending to be. Li Nanheng's masculine scent was vividly displayed. There was the smell of laundry detergent on clean clothes and a very faint and somewhat intoxicating scent of tobacco. Feng Ling didn't know if the man's breathing when he was sleeping made her feel at ease, but she gradually closed her eyes. She didn't know how long she had slept. In her dream, Feng Ling felt that she seemed to be imprisoned somewhere and couldn't move her hands and feet. She suddenly woke up and almost bumped into the man's face when she turned her eyes. At first glance, she saw that it was Boss Li who was still sleeping. Her heart beat even faster from the shock. She looked at the man's handsome face that was close to her and then lowered her head to see that her calf was directly pressed by his long leg and her two arms were held by him. She was completely held in the man's arms. Feng Ling quietly and gently pushed his hand away. When she got up to move his legs away, the man's brows suddenly furrowed. He abruptly opened his eyes in the darkness and looked at her with his sleepy and dark eyes. "What are you doing?" She wasn't sure if he knew the position he was in when he was sleeping, so she kicked his leg away and stood up. "I'm going to the bathroom." When Li Nanheng was asleep, he was like a sleeping lion. At this moment, he was like a lion that was suddenly awakened. His eyes were dark and dangerous. Perhaps it was his natural sensitivity, but after glancing at her again, he glanced at the bed under the two of them and found that he had unintentionally moved closer to her side when he was asleep. He alone occupied almost 2/3 of the space. Without speaking again, he turned over and continued to sleep with his back to her. Feng Ling didn't know whether Boss Li was unhappy because she woke him up or because of something else, but in this case, the more she said, the more suspicious she would be, so she simply continued to remain silent. She went to the bathroom and stayed for a while. After going to the toilet, she slowly returned to the bed. However, as soon as she climbed into bed, Li Nanheng suddenly stood up. She couldn't help looking up at the man who suddenly stood up. Seeing that Li Nanheng also turned to go to the toilet, she lay down again. However, after the man came back from the toilet, he felt that the ward was a little stuffy, especially when the two of them slept on the bed together. He was about to open the window when he saw that it was raining intermittently outside. It was not suitable to open the window in the autumn rain season. It was easy to catch a cold, not to mention this was a ward, and there was a patient living in it. He glanced out of the window into the dark night, took off his shirt, and walked back. Still not sleeping? After taking off his clothes, Li Nanheng casually threw the jacket and black t-shirt aside, and then untied his belt. Under Feng Ling's stunned expression, he seemed to hesitate for a moment, and finally fastened the belt again, and walked to the bed. In the 30 seconds when the man untied and fastened his belt, Feng Ling could only see his perfect upper body with the dim night light in the ward. Every inch of his abdominal muscles was extremely sexy, and he only wore this pair of black trousers. The simple trousers that matched the combat uniform wrapped around his two straight, slender, and powerful legs. As the silver buckle in front of the belt was buckled again, it was even more sexy, as if he was tempting her to commit a crime. He sat back on the bed and saw that Feng Ling's eyes were open a moment ago, but now they were closed. "Are you a corpse?" "Feng Ling." "Boss, go to sleep." The man snorted. "How can I sleep like this?" Look at your expression. If I don't know, I might think I'm going to rape your corpse. Feng Ling, he lay down with his upper body bare, turned over, and looked at Feng Ling. He moved his fingers and directly pulled the boy's ear, but his eyes were as indifferent as water. Why are your ears so red? Do you have a fever? Feng Ling didn't answer, closed her eyes, and pretended to fall asleep. Seeing that this guy had learned to shut up, Li Nanheng didn't embarrass her. The rain outside the window was still pattering, knocking on the window, making the ward particularly quiet. The boy's breathing gradually stabilized from the beginning, and unexpectedly, he had a good night's sleep. But why were his ears red all the time? Maybe, it was really too stuffy in the ward. 3 days later, Feng Ling was discharged from the hospital. When she was discharged, Kay and the others happened to be on a mission, so they passed by the hospital to take a look. Li Nanheng's car was naturally parked downstairs. During the week when Feng Ling was hospitalized, Li Nanheng appeared a total of 3 times. The first and second time, he directly stayed in her ward, and the third time, he came to pick up the recovered wounded on behalf of the base. It was actually very stressful to be a glorious wounded in the base, but fortunately, Feng Ling had a good interpersonal relationship in the base. She usually had good grades and was low-key and silent, so this time when she was injured and hospitalized, no one in the base found fault with her or took the opportunity to spread her nonsense. Finally, after getting the doctor's signature, Feng Ling returned to the ward, changed out of the hospital gown, picked up the combat suit, and was about to put it on. She changed her clothes very quickly, and because she knew that she was going to be discharged today, she had already changed into the clothes that she usually wore in the base. She wore a loose sling vest over the chest wrap, which made her look especially like a man, and a loose white t-shirt over the vest. Chapter 830. Just like that, Li Nanheng leaned against the wall by the door and looked thoughtfully at her clothes that she hadn't put on her coat yet. Feng Ling's heart skipped a beat. She instantly rejoiced that she had already prepared a few more measures. Otherwise, Boss Li would definitely see through it. I've been waiting for you downstairs for half an hour. Is it so troublesome to leave the hospital? Do you need me to buy you a set of men's skincare products so that you can clean up from head to toe before coming out? The man glanced at her leisurely. Feng Ling happened to have her back to him and couldn't see his chest. From this angle, she really couldn't see anything. She could only see that the boy was really especially thin. Hearing the man's footsteps seem to be approaching, Feng Ling quickly picked up the black combat uniform and put it on. She quickly pulled up the zipper with one hand and raised her hand to push her short hair back. She looked at the man who had already approached. Boss, we can go now. However, the man had already walked up to her. He lowered his eyes to look at her, pretending to be calm, and then glanced at her ears, which were no longer red. He recalled that her ears had also been red after she fell asleep that night, and he stared at her with a deep gaze for a while. Boss. Feng Ling raised her eyes and lowered her voice. Is there anything else? Li Nanheng glanced at her and his gaze fell on her neckline. The neckline is crooked. Oh. Feng Ling raised her hand to adjust the neckline. When she raised her eyes again, the man had already retracted his gaze and turned to leave. After returning to the base, it was inevitable that she would be greeted by a group of base members who were close to her. Even Feng Ling herself did not expect that the family of the mayor of Foy State, Mr. Ted, who had gone on the cruise with Xiao Fei to rescue her, had actually come to the base early. When they learned that she had been injured in the rescue incident, they were very grateful and apologetic and brought many gifts for her. At that time, Feng Ling was in the hospital. According to the rules of 11 base, outsiders were not allowed to visit her, so they sent all the gifts to the base and to her room. Those things included many expensive but very useful electronic products and a military medal that Mayor Ted personally awarded to Feng Ling. Such things shouldn't be awarded casually, but Mayor Ted made an exception and gave it to Feng Ling. After Feng Ling returned to the base, he personally called her and expressed his gratitude. He was also very grateful that she had chosen to throw the child off the cruise. Otherwise, if the child had been injured in the explosion, their family would probably live in pain for the rest of their lives. When Fong Ling returned to her room, she saw a pile of things on the bed. After receiving a call from Mayor Ted and his wife, she knew what was going on. In this season, Los Angeles gradually became cold. When she returned to the base in the afternoon, the wind was already howling outside. Boss Lee allowed her to rest today and resume training tomorrow, but Fong Ling still insisted on going to Team 1 to train in the wind and rain. After Kay, Tam, and the other two returned from their mission, she would continue to receive high-intensity sniper training. It rained heavily for several hours. When the training was over, every member ran back to their residence like a drowned rat. As always, Fong Ling walked back alone. Just as she was about to walk back downstairs, she suddenly felt a weight on her wrist. She turned her eyes abruptly and was stunned when she saw Deputy Drillmaster Chow coming over with an umbrella. Before she spoke, she was suddenly dragged into the corridor by Chow Fei. After entering, Chow Fei threw the umbrella aside and looked at Fong Ling, who was soaked. He looked her up and down and then his eyes fell on her face. "Are you all right? Are you all right?" Seeing the worry in Chow Fei's eyes, Fong Ling almost forgot that her secret had been discovered by him. Her face remained unchanged and she just looked at the young and handsome man in front of her. "Thank you for your concern, Deputy Drillmaster Chow. I just inhaled some thick smoke. After a few days of treatment, I'm fine." "No matter how fine you are, you can't work so hard. Do you really think you are a man? You just left the hospital and went out to train in the heavy rain. The sniper team has no training schedule today, but you went to Team 1 to find Han Jin. He is a big man who doesn't know how to be flexible at all. Why did he let you train when you said you wanted to train? Can't he let you come back to rest?" "Deputy Drillmaster Chow, I'm a member of the base. I've missed so many days of training, and the strength of my limbs will definitely be greatly affected. If I miss one day of training, it will only affect the time when I can really pick up a sniper rifle in the future. I'm responsible for myself. Drillmaster Han also knows what I mean, so he asked me to resume training directly. Besides, it's common for me to train in such a heavy rain. I've been in the base for so many years, so I won't be affected just because of this afternoon." And she looked at him seriously. Although her voice was low, it was exceptionally serious. "I am a man." Chow Fei looked at her for a while and smiled. "Are you still worried that I will tell your secret? Don't worry. I believe in Deputy Drillmaster Chow, but I hope that you can treat me as a man like before. In the explosion of the oil tank, I just inhaled the smoke and was not injured by the explosion, nor did I suffer any serious internal or external injuries. I'm already very lucky to be alive. I just hope that I can become more and more stable in the base in the future, so gender doesn't matter to me. If everyone can do it, I can do it too. Deputy Drillmaster Chow, please forget what happened on the island at that time. I'm just a member of the sniper team and don't need any special treatment." Chow Fei frowned. "Okay, I won't give you any differential treatment, but you have just been discharged from the hospital. I haven't seen you for a week. You have lost so much weight and went to train in the rain. If you continue to work like this, if you really faint on the training ground one day and are sent to the dressing room to be stripped naked, you won't be able to hide it. You'd better pay more attention to your body." "Okay, I will pay attention to it. Thank you, Deputy Drillmaster Chow, for reminding me." Fong Ling looked straight at him, and her attitude was still neither servile nor overbearing. She did not have any sense of guilt because her secret was caught by others. "Deputy Drillmaster Chow, it hasn't been long since you joined the sniper team. When did you become so familiar with Fong Ling? You have just been discharged from the hospital and returned to the base. What did Deputy Drillmaster Chow remind you of?" Suddenly, a clear and low voice rang outside the door beside them. Chapter 831. As soon as she met Li Nanheng's gaze, Fong Ling took a step back. Her expression didn't change and she greeted indifferently, "Boss." Chow Fei wasn't sure if Boss Li had heard the conversation between him and Fong Ling. He turned his head to take a look but didn't find any clue from Li Nanheng's expression, so he didn't say anything but explained, Feng Ling was injured on a rescue mission on the cruise ship with me. I saw her jump into the sea because of the explosion and personally fished her out of the sea. I didn't have time to visit her during the week in the hospital. Seeing that she came back today, I asked her a few questions and reminded her to pay attention to her health during training and not to work so hard. Li Nanheng glanced at Xiao Fei's face indifferently. Why didn't you go with the members of the sniper team today? Why did you let the 4 members who are still in training go there by themselves? Kay and the other 3 members are very good at shooting. It's enough for them to go on this kind of mission. If the mission is too dangerous, I will definitely go with them. Xiao Fei smiled lightly. Boss, Feng Ling is also a member of the sniper team. You are unhappy that I didn't go with the other 4 members, but you are unhappy that I care about another member. It's really difficult for me to be an assistant drill master. However, when Xiao Fei said this, he continued to meet Li Nanheng's eyes, only to find that Boss Li's eyes were extremely cold. Compared with the coldness, what made Xiao Fei more nervous was the coldness and ruthlessness in his eyes. Since Xiao Fei entered the base, he knew that Boss Li was not someone to be trifled with, but at this moment, he felt that Boss was really not someone to be trifled with. However, Boss Li was really too concerned about Feng Ling. Did Boss Li also know Feng Ling's secret? Impossible. First of all, Li Nanheng was the person in charge of 11 base. He had responsibilities. If he knew Feng Ling's gender, no matter from which angle, he had to act according to the rules and regulations of the base. It was absolutely impossible for him to let Feng Ling stay here, nor could he rest assured to let her go on all kinds of missions. And if Boss had known that Feng Ling was a girl, he wouldn't have been so merciless as to let her receive all kinds of intensive training, and the intensity of the intensive training was even heavier than that of Kay and the other rough men. Go back to Team 2 if you can't do it. There are plenty of drill masters in the base who are proficient in long guns and sniper rifles, Li Nanheng said mercilessly. All the drill masters in the base were excellent members who had been trained here for many years. They had long been accustomed to Boss Li's merciless and vicious tongue, but they also knew that although Boss's mouth was not pleasant, every time he went out on a mission, he cared about the lives of every member and would never allow anyone to die. Except for his bad temper, everything else was good. Xiao Fei was already used to it. Especially after he joined the sniper team, Boss Li's gaze became more and more unpleasant. Now, Li Nanheng had already approached, and his noble and cold face was only left with an uneasy sense of oppression. Boss, it's fine that you usually make fun of us, but there are members here. No matter what, you have to give me, the deputy drill master, some face, right? Xiao Fei stood beside Feng Ling and laughed to save some face for himself. Then he glanced sideways and hinted Feng Ling to leave first. Feng Ling turned around quietly and was about to leave when Li Nanheng suddenly stopped her. Stop, did I say you can leave? Feng Ling paused and suddenly turned to look at him. The man walked to her side, leaned over, and his cold breath hit the back of her ear. When you first returned to the base, you went to Team 1 to look for Han Jin. What did you say at that time? I said that I had been delayed in the hospital for so many days, and my limbs felt a little stiff. I needed to resume training immediately. Otherwise, it would affect all aspects of the sniper team in the future, Feng Ling answered calmly. Did I ask you to take a break this afternoon? Yes, boss asked me to rest, but I asked to go back to training. So you felt wronged when you encountered a rainstorm during training? No, I didn't. If you didn't feel wronged, why would Deputy Drill Master Qiao bring you here and comfort you? If you feel uncomfortable, shouldn't you tell your boss directly? When did Deputy Drill Master Qiao become your part-time psychiatrist? Li Nanheng's voice was light and cold, but Feng Ling clearly felt that this man seemed to be very unhappy. But Feng Ling still heard the meaning behind his words. He was warning her to keep a distance from Xiao Fei in the future. Xiao Fei was the deputy drill master of the sniper team. She didn't have much contact with him except during training. Why did he suddenly remind her to keep a distance? At most, he was saved by Xiao Fei on the island last time, and he was caught talking here today. That's all. Standing by the side, Xiao Fei raised his hand to his lips and coughed. He cleared his throat and said, "Boss, Feng Ling is a member of the sniper team. He was injured right before my eyes. It's only right for me to say a few words of concern." "I don't like hearing your words." Li Nanheng didn't wait for Feng Ling's words but Xiao Fei's. He suddenly smiled, but his eyes were cold. The moment he turned his eyes, it seemed that he could freeze Xiao Fei into a popsicle and insert him into the crack of the wall. You pulled her into the corridor and whispered to her. "You two men, are you concerned about her?" Did he mean to provoke Xiao Fei? Feng Ling looked back at the strange light in the eyes of the two bosses. One was cold and indifferent, and the other was smiling. She immediately shook her wrist that was a little sore from training. The rain outside had already stopped, but she was wet and looked extremely embarrassed. Unlike the young master of the Li family beside her, even though he was wearing the same uniform as everyone else, he still looked noble and luxurious. Just by standing beside her, her aura would make people feel pressured and extremely cold. In addition, Xiao Fei, who always showed a smiling face but was actually not simple, only felt that it would be extremely troublesome if her gender was known by Boss or Xiao Fei. "Boss, Deputy Drillmaster Xiao, I'm still wet. Can you let me go back to take a shower first? Otherwise, if I really catch a cold tomorrow, I'm afraid I'll really faint on the training ground. At that time, I'll lose the face of the sniper team." Feng Ling shook her wrist and raised her hand to press her shoulder. Chapter 832. Feng Ling didn't wait for Boss Li to speak, turned around, and walked upstairs quickly. Li Nanheng looked at the guy who didn't take him seriously at all and watched her back, and his eyes sank into unprecedented darkness. In just 2 minutes, Xiao Fei felt as if a century had passed under Boss Li's eyes. Hearing the footsteps that were gradually getting higher and farther upstairs, he immediately smiled. "Boss, you know my temper. I'm nice to everyone in the base. Feng Ling is now my subordinate. I watch them train every day and more or less have feelings for them. But boss, you're usually not close to anyone. Why are you so special to Feng Ling all of a sudden?" Li Nanheng put his hand in his trouser pocket and asked coldly, "What's special about him? Although Feng Ling does look like a little girl, he is still a man. Boss, don't take pity on him. We are used to being vegetarian in the base. I can understand your loneliness, but Feng Ling is straight. Even if you want to turn him, he may not be willing to accept you." Li Nanheng opened his lips and said, "You think too much. That's good. After all, boss, you are the only heir of the Li family. The elders are all waiting for you to marry a wife and give birth to a great-grandchild or great-granddaughter for them to hold. If you turn gay..." Xiao Fei didn't finish his words. He just smiled meaningfully and didn't finish his words. Li Nanheng didn't look at him again, turned and went upstairs with a swish, and strode upstairs. Boss Li and a member of the sniper team lived in this building. Xiao Fei didn't live here, so he had no reason to go upstairs. However, he thought of the way Feng Ling went upstairs without looking back and Feng Ling's indifferent expression in front of Boss Li. Boss probably didn't know that she was a woman. But who was Li Nanheng? He was a cold bystander who seemed to stand outside the secular world. Even if he didn't spend much time with Feng Ling, with Li Nanheng's keenness, it was impossible that he didn't notice or suspect something. After some thought, Xiao Fei picked up his phone and walked out. Feng Ling had just returned to her room. This time, the windows and doors couldn't be locked from the inside. Only the bathroom had a lock, so she entered the bathroom directly. As soon as she took off her clothes, her white body was exposed to the air. She undid the chest-wrapping cloth on her body while looking at herself in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. After untying the cloth on her chest, she was about to turn around to turn in the hot water when she suddenly heard her phone ring. She picked up her phone and saw a message from Xiao Fei. "Feng Xiaoling, does Boss Li know your secret?" Feng Ling looked at the boy he had specially added in the middle of her name. No matter how she looked at it, it was an eyesore. She stared at the phone screen for a while with a straight face and replied, "He doesn't know." "Xiao Fei, that's good. Girls should remember to protect themselves when living with a group of men, especially when you live next door to Boss Li. If you really find it inconvenient, you can apply to move out. I also have a few empty rooms in my building. I can make one for you." Feng Ling, "No need. Boss doesn't usually enter my room. Other than the fact that he drank too much, Xiao Fei, are you sure it's safe to live next door to Boss Li?" Why did he have an inexplicable feeling that Boss Li would eat Feng Ling up at any moment? "Feng Ling, it's very safe. My personal privacy has not been threatened or violated. Thank you for your concern, Deputy Drillmaster Chiao. I'm going to take a shower. See you on the training ground tomorrow." After replying, Feng Ling put the phone aside and turned to take a shower. Receiving such a reply, Xiao Fei didn't know what to say. He wanted to say good night again, but when he saw Feng Ling's words of, "Thank you, Deputy Drillmaster Chiao, for your concern," she didn't even call his name directly. It could be seen that although Feng Ling was young, it was clear that she knew what to do in her heart, so she would keep a distance and wouldn't cross the line easily. The sound of the bathroom next door continued. Li Nanheng stood on the balcony of his room and vaguely heard the sound coming from the bathroom next door. He stood with his long legs against the light, his left hand in his trouser pocket, and he was still wearing the combat uniform that he wanted to take off but found it a little cold, so he put it on again. He turned his head to look at the light on the balcony next door, and his deep eyes glowed. After taking a shower, Feng Ling put on her clothes in the bathroom, opened the locked bathroom door, rubbed her wet hair, and walked back to the bed. The pile of gifts sent by Mayor Ted and his family on her bed had not been cleaned up. She put down her hand that had been rubbing her hair and was about to go over to collect those things when she suddenly heard a text message on her cell phone. She thought it was from Xiao Fei, so she didn't rush to read it. After putting those things on the bed one by one on the table and in the cabinet, she picked up her cell phone. She turned on her cell phone and saw the words, "Boss Li." At the same time, there were only two cold words from Boss Li on the screen, "Come over." Feng Ling raised her eyes and turned to look outside. She saw the light on the balcony next door, thought for a moment, put down her cell phone, and turned to walk out. When she arrived next door, she raised her hand and knocked twice on the door. After a few seconds, the door opened. The man's tall and slender figure stood in the door, his sharp eyes scanning her from head to toe. His tone was cold. "What took you so long?" "I was tidying up the things sent by Mr. Ted and his family and didn't have time to look at my cell phone." "Are you interested in those gifts?" As Li Nanheng spoke, he turned and walked in. Feng Ling watched the man's back and followed him in. She didn't answer his previous question and only said, "Boss, did you call me over for something?" The window on Li Nanheng's balcony was open, and there was a thin laptop on the solid wood table by the balcony. The man pointed to the laptop. "I want you to look at something." Hearing this, Feng Ling walked over. The moment she reached the table, her shoulders suddenly sank. The man's strong palm pressed down on her shoulder, asking her to sit down. When Feng Ling raised her head to look at him in surprise, the man pointed to the laptop with his chin. "Open it. The password is 9632. Chapter 833. Take a look at the things inside. There are no women in the base, only a group of rough men, and I don't have any secretaries or assistants around me. These documents usually need a careful, tight-lipped person to sort out. On the one hand, you fit the category of tight-lipped and have strong self-control. On the other hand, you are very serious and meticulous in everything you do. Besides, you live very close to me, so it's convenient for you to sort things out. I'll leave this task to you in the future." The man withdrew his gaze from the computer screen and looked at the boy sitting at the table. After looking at it for a while, Feng Ling found that most of the documents were not particularly secret, but there were indeed some secret documents in the deed disk of the computer. Each of these documents required a password, which meant that Boss Lee had to tell the password in person before opening it, so it would not involve the important secrets of the base. She nodded. Yes, except for training and tasks, as long as I have enough time, I can do it. Don't you want to ask why I specially asked you to come over to sort out these? The man glanced at her face. Boss, since you called me over and told me the password to your computer, it means that you've decided to use me after some consideration. Since you've decided, and you said that I'm tight-lipped, I don't need to ask why. I forgot to mention one of your strengths. Your ability to accept things is really good. Li Nanheng's voice was very light, but with absolute command. No matter what confidential documents you see, you must keep your mouth shut. Can you do that? Feng Ling's hands left the computer keyboard, stood up, and turned back to look at the man who was more than a head taller than her. Don't doubt the people you use. As long as Boss trusts me, I can do it. Feng Ling didn't expect that Boss would stand so close to her. After saying this, she closed her mouth and stood there, not knowing whether to step back or not. The room was also very quiet after her words. Li Nanheng watched the boy who stood up and turned around. The two of them stood very close to each other, so close that when Feng Ling spoke, the faint fragrance of her body and the mint smell of freshly showered and brushed against his neck. His eyes instantly revealed an unknown darkness. After about 4 or 5 seconds, Feng Ling moved the chair that was blocking her and retreated a certain distance. Boss, do you have anything else to tell me? Feng Ling said, pointing to the time on the wall. I have to do balance training in the dormitory at night. I just returned to the base and need to recover bit by bit. If I don't do balance training in the evening, I'm afraid I can't hold on for the whole day training tomorrow. Li Nanheng glanced sideways. My space is big enough. You can do balance training here. I can also see how your sense of balance is now. Feng Ling glanced at the training cushion placed next to her. Considering that she could do balance training alone in her residence, she just needed to bend her arms and lie prone on the ground for an hour. She didn't think she would be discovered, so she didn't refuse. She walked over, picked up the training cushion, and laid it on the ground. Then she habitually took off her shoes and lay down on her stomach. She kept her whole body balanced, raised her head, and used her elbows and toes as the fulcrum. Her posture was standard, and she could maintain her balance for a long time. She was very confident about this. Li Nanheng glanced at her incredibly white and tender feet and then moved his eyes to her motionless and slender back when she was doing balance training. He walked over and watched her maintain this posture. Right now, Feng Ling was wearing a set of loose black trousers and a loose white t-shirt. This was what she usually wore when she slept, but because she was lying down, the loose clothes drooped down, and it could be clearly seen that Feng Ling's waist was different from that of a man's. Especially since the boy had just showered and came over, his hair was half dry, with a few strands hanging on his cheeks and forehead. Li Nanheng stood on the side. His legs were long and slender, and his side profile was noble. He did not speak, and his eyes were as deep as the abyss. His fingertips slid across the black cell phone he had just picked up, and suddenly, he took a photo of the back of the boy lying prone on the ground. His cell phone was muted, so there was no sound when he took the photo. Feng Ling was doing balance training seriously and did not look back. One was doing the training, and the other stood by and watched. After about half an hour, Feng Ling suddenly paused, stood up, and looked back at the tall man. Boss, I'll affect your rest if I do the training here. I'd better go back to my room to continue. This kind of balance training was simple, but no matter how many years people had practiced it, as long as it lasted more than 10 minutes, they would sweat all over, and Feng Ling was no exception. Although she had just taken a shower, there was obviously some sweat on her face, and there was also some sweat around her white neck and collarbone. It does affect my rest. Go back. These cold words immediately liberated Feng Ling. She turned and walked out of his room quickly. It was not until the door was closed by Feng Ling from outside that Li Nanheng looked at the soft cushion on the ground again and closed his eyes. In his mind, the scene of the boy's white toes bending slightly on the soft cushion because of too much force, and the boy's slender back, a certain feeling began to rise from his lower abdomen, and it was steaming hot. Li Nanheng suddenly opened his eyes and stared at his crotch with an ugly expression. F***ck, it was just a very ordinary balance support movement in his room, and he actually had an erection. At this moment, Nanheng looked at the disobedient little brother in his lower body, which not only did not disappear at all, but also gradually raised up because of a certain image in his mind. In an instant, his eyes became cold and ruthless, and the color was as strong as the deep sea at night, dangerous and low. He was a man, absolutely a straight man. But he actually had an erection in front of a man? The door that had just been closed was suddenly knocked again, and then Feng Ling came in again. She didn't look at his eyes but just stared at the pair of shoes she left on the ground, saying, "Boss, I left my shoes here." She quickly ran over to put them on, and then quickly turned and ran out. Nanheng watched Feng Ling run in with a pair of white and tender little feet, put on her shoes, and went out. He watched Feng Ling's back quickly disappear in front of the door, and then she slammed the door outside. Chapter 834. Feng Ling had just walked out of the door in her shoes when she suddenly heard footsteps approaching in this direction. She subconsciously felt as if her back was burning and couldn't help speeding up to rush back to her room. However, she suddenly heard the sound of the door being locked behind her. Click, Feng Ling paused and couldn't help looking back at the door of Boss Li's room. Did she hear that sound correctly? Did Boss suddenly lock the door from the inside? What did she do to make Boss lock the door in such a short period of time, as if he hated her to the core? Just when Feng Ling was confused and didn't know what happened, Nanheng had entered the bathroom with a dark face, slammed the bathroom door, turned on the shower, and took a cold shower in the early autumn rainy night. It wasn't until he had washed himself clean that he walked out with a cold expression on his face. When he was about to take a cigarette, his eyes suddenly fell on the soft cushion on the ground that hadn't been put away. He walked over with a dark look and bent down to put away the soft cushion, but there seemed to be a faint smell of someone on the soft cushion. It was a very, very faint fragrance that he didn't know how to describe. It was an indescribable body fragrance that was usually covered by the smell of shower gel. Damn, how could a man have body fragrance? Nanheng glanced at the soft cushion on the ground again, rolled it up and threw it aside. Then he looked down at his little brother who was about to raise his head again. He pursed his lips coldly, turned around, picked up a box of cigarettes, and walked to the balcony. At night, 11 Base was quiet. The slogans and gunshots that usually sounded on various training grounds had long disappeared at this time. It was so quiet that one could even hear the howling in the mountains and jungles and not far away. It had been 3 months since Feng Ling was hospitalized due to injury, and the weather had already entered winter. In order not to affect the stretching of their movements, the members in the base still wore the same black uniforms as in summer during training. They only added a very thick layer of something similar to knee pads on the knees and elbows to prevent frostbite. However, because there was a lot of physical exercise during training, even if the weather was a few degrees below zero, they still sweated all over. Years of exercise made every member very good physical fitness, and they didn't easily catch a cold. Except for the explosion on the cruise ship, Feng Ling had not been sick much, and she had been training hard in the past 3 months after returning to the base. After 3 months of training, she, Kay, and the other 3 had successfully obtained the sniper rifles arranged for them by the base and learned some basic knowledge of how to operate a sniper rifle. Xiao Fei could tell that Feng Ling really wanted to keep her gender a secret. In the beginning, he more or less took special care of her. Later, when Feng Ling clearly expressed her stance, he gradually stopped treating her as special. However, during every sniper training session, he would stand behind the other 4 and even hold their waists. When it came to Feng Ling, he had to maintain an appropriate distance and was not allowed to casually hug her. After all, she was a girl. Although he liked her very much, Feng Ling's character was really too cold, and she kept expressing her attitude. Even if Xiao Fei was moved, he didn't even have a chance to take a step closer to her. More importantly, Boss Lee often inspected by the side, and a casual glance from him could freeze people to death. At 5:30 in the afternoon, there were several gunshots on the training ground in the ice and snow. Fong Ling was the last one to hold a sniper rifle and shoot at the target 300 meters away, but she was also the only one among the 5 people who aimed at the center ring at such a long distance. Seeing that she actually hit the bullseye 300 meters away, Kay put down the sniper rifle in his hand in disbelief and turned to look at Fong Ling. Fuck, not bad. Last time, Deputy Drillmaster Chiao said that many people may not be able to hit the bullseye 300 meters away after getting a sniper rifle for a year. How long have you been holding a sniper rifle? Are you trying to beat the 4 of us with your training results? Fong Ling put down the gun and looked at the bullseye in the distance. It's just a coincidence. If I shoot again, I'll probably miss it. Motherf asterisk Kerr, if I can be as lucky as you in the sniper rifle assessment next month, Boss won't have to kick me every time he sees me. Tam sneered and then glanced at Fong Ling's indifferent expression. How on earth did you find such a good target? This is 300 meters, not 100 meters. That's right. When we just got the sniper rifle, Boss Lee, such a strict person, told us to keep calm and not to rush too close, because after more than 100 meters, every 10 meters is equivalent to a very difficult obstacle. However, you easily hit the bullseye 300 meters away. You might as well be the only one in the sniper team. The 4 of us should go back to Team 1 and play close combat. Kay walked up to Fong Ling with a smile, raised his hand, and patted her shoulder. Come on, shoot again. Anyway, Boss is in a meeting today and is not here. I'll take you as my master for the time being. Teach me, how did you find the target so easily? Fong Ling rolled her eyes at him and warned him to take his hand away, but Kay was too familiar with her for so many years. Not only did he not let go of her hand, but he also leaned against her shoulder and signaled her to shoot again. Hurry up. We're all watching. As he spoke, Kay put his arm around the back of Fong Ling's neck and leaned in to say, Boy, you're so thin. I really wonder how you can withstand the explosive force of a sniper rifle. Fong Ling's eyes widened, and her face turned red. Fong Ling was about to speak when suddenly a force came from behind. Kay, who was holding her like a brother, was pulled away. He turned to look at Xiao Fei with a dumbfounded expression and asked blankly, Deputy Drillmaster Chiao? Xiao Fei glanced at him. What did you do just now? Kay thought for a long time but couldn't figure out what he did wrong. Why was he thrown away by the Deputy Drillmaster so vigorously? He looked at the other 3 who were also stunned, and then at Fong Ling who always looked cold and indifferent. He coughed and turned back to say, Chiao, Brother Chiao, I didn't do anything. Chapter 835. Kay was a little speechless. They were all brothers of the same family. They fought together in the mud pit of the training ground. It was normal for them to hug each other. Wasn't it normal for men to put their arms around each other's shoulders? Why did this have anything to do with the image of the sniper team? Usually, Boss Lee didn't like this and was strict with them, so they were used to it. When Boss Lee was here, none of them dared to mess around, but now Deputy Drillmaster Chiao also looked murderous. Xiao Fei didn't look at him again but turned to look at Fong Ling. Fong Ling, come with me. Fong Ling put down the sniper rifle she had just picked up and turned to follow him out without saying a word. When they were a certain distance away from the training ground, Xiao Fei looked around indifferently. Seeing that no one was approaching, he turned his eyes to Fong Ling's face. I remember Kay said that your birthday is in winter, right? Probably in November. Which date? Xiao Fei asked. I'm not sure when I was born. I've told you more than once that I'm an orphan. I don't know much about my infancy. My birthday was decided by someone for me, Fong Ling explained simply. I'm not sure when I was born. Said it in November? Yes. Xiao Fei nodded with a smile. Okay, it's already mid-November. Tomorrow is Saturday, and the training will end earlier in the afternoon. How about I invite you out for dinner? Just take it as a make-up birthday for you. Deputy Drill Master Chiao, I'm not sure when my birthday is, so I don't think it's necessary. Besides, why don't you? In recent years, many brothers in our base who are popular often go out to eat and drink for 2 days on their birthdays. As for you, you haven't celebrated your birthday for several years. I used to regard you as a careless brat, but now only I know that you are a girl. A girl's mind is more or less sensitive and fragile. If you are ignored for a long time, your heart will become more and more depressed. I think it's better to take you to eat delicious food tomorrow and let you be yourself for a day. It can be regarded as a birthday party with you. Xiao Fei said as he took out a small velvet box from his pocket. I bought you a birthday present last week. It's a pair of white diamond earrings. I didn't pay much attention to your ears before, but I found that you don't even have an ear piercing. Kay and the other men have pierced one ear, but you don't even have an ear piercing. Should I give you this earring or not? If you give it to me, I don't know how you should wear it. If you don't, you are the only girl in the entire base who is suitable to wear this kind of thing. Feng Ling was amused by his tone and gave a rare smile. Even if I have an ear piercing, I can't wear it. You'd better keep it. If you meet any girl you like, just give it to her. I don't need these. The girl you like is right in front of you. Will you meet any girl you like in the future? Xiao Fei stared at her smiling eyes and said directly. Feng Ling didn't understand his words at first, but when she did, the young man in front of her had already raised his eyebrows and smiled at her. Feng Ling, who had received a confession for the first time in her life, was stunned. At this time, her hand was suddenly pulled up by Xiao Fei and he put the velvet box with a pair of white diamond earrings into her palm. Take it. I'm not in a hurry to let you wear it, but you have to accept it. In the future, when you want to become a woman again, remember to wear this on your ears after piercing your ears. Feng Ling abruptly pushed the box back into his hand. I can't take it. Just take it. Xiao Fei's eyes suddenly became a little fierce. It's just a birthday gift. Why are you so reserved? No, Deputy Drill Master Chiao, I have no reason to accept your gift, and I don't intend to change back to a woman. Before he could finish speaking, a figure suddenly approached from the side. Xiao Fei's sharp eyes saw the person approaching, and he quickly retracted his hand, directly grabbing the velvet box that had just been pushed back into his palm. When Han Jin approached, he caught a glimpse of Xiao Fei's calm expression and then glanced at Feng Ling. He didn't know what Feng Ling was thinking with her head down, so he called her. Feng Ling, why are you in a daze? Drill Master Han. Feng Ling looked back and saw him, and her expression became as calm as usual as if nothing had happened just now. Why are you and Xiao Fei pulling each other's arm here? Boss Li asked you to go to his room to get the computer and take the materials to the base conference room to find him. After Han Jin finished speaking, his phone rang. He looked curiously at the thing in Xiao Fei's hand. He didn't see it clearly, so he turned around and walked away while answering the phone. He didn't ask or stay any longer. Seeing that Han Jin had left, Feng Ling took a step back and nodded politely to Xiao Fei, who was about to hand the velvet box to her again. I'll send the materials to Boss Li first. With that, she turned to leave. Hey, Feng. Xiao Fei was about to call her, but he saw that Feng Ling walked away quickly as if her feet were smeared with oil. He just couldn't help but want to celebrate this little girl's birthday and confess his feelings. Why did this Feng Ling seem to be frightened? She had been disguised as a man for too long and had never been confessed to before. Was it too sudden? Did he really scare the little girl? Boss Li's computer was currently only accessible to him and Feng Ling, and only the two of them knew the password. It was actually a very serious matter to go to his room to retrieve the information from the computer. Feng Ling went to get the computer without any distractions, found the information that Boss Li had casually told her last night, and put it on the table. Then she stood up with the computer and went out. She rushed to the base conference room. Several leaders of the base and several military leaders were inside. Feng Ling walked in silently, put down the computer, and was about to leave when Xiao Su, who was sitting next to Li Nanheng, suddenly said, "Boss, in fact, Feng Ling is a good candidate." Last time in the hotel box, she dressed up as Boss Li, and she looked quite good. Hearing this, Feng Ling's eyes fell on Xiao Su's face and then turned to Li Nanheng sitting in the center of the conference table. At the same time, everyone in the base conference room turned their eyes to Feng Ling and even looked her up and down. Chapter 836. Because Li Nanheng didn't speak, no one here spoke, but their eyes were still fixed on Feng Ling. Put it down and go back first. As if he hadn't heard Xiao Su's suggestion, Li Nanheng coldly put out the cigarette in his hand in the ashtray on the conference table. Li Nanheng's voice was so cold that Xiao Su, who was sitting on the side, felt that he shouldn't have made this suggestion. He immediately shivered and shrank back without saying anything. However, just as Feng Ling nodded and was about to leave, one of the military leaders suddenly said, "I think he is really suitable for this operation. His name is Feng Ling, right? Previously, when we rescued Mayor Ted and his family, he made a great contribution. Furthermore, our people have seen his skills and agility. He is a very reliable member. Furthermore, based on his figure and appearance, if he were to participate in this operation, it would definitely be much easier." Li Nanheng raised his eyes to look at Feng Ling, who was standing in front of the conference room. His eyes were deep and calm, but there seemed to be a huge whirlpool in them, making it difficult for people to read his mind. However, Feng Ling clearly felt that this mission should not be simple, and Boss Li didn't intend to let her participate in it from the beginning. The U.S. military had gradually become particularly dependent on 11 Base over the years. When they encountered some difficult situations, they would directly turn to 11 Base for help. But if they could come to the base in person, it must not be a simple matter. Another comrade in charge of the military also said, "He is indeed very suitable." The other people at the conference table also nodded one after another, including the other drill masters in the base. Indeed, in the entire base, Feng Ling is indeed the most suitable. After hearing these words, Li Nanheng didn't have any expression. He crossed his legs, leaned back, and raised his eyebrows, like a cold emperor, lazy and noble. So, this kind of mission to sneak into the terrorist base is given to a newcomer who has just entered the base for less than 3 years? And he is a member of the team who has just learned how to pick up a sniper rifle? Xiao Su paused and coughed. He felt that Boss Li had always been very proud of Feng Ling's skills, speed, and other aspects. No matter how strict and sarcastic he was to Feng Ling, he would definitely maintain his dignity in public and would never say a word about Feng Ling. But today, Boss obviously didn't intend to let Feng Ling be in the limelight. It seemed that Boss didn't intend to let Feng Ling participate in this mission at all. The person in charge of the military said, "Mr. Li, what we need now is not only flexibility but also a woman who can absolutely cooperate with us and has the ability to protect herself. But there is no woman in 11 Base, and we can't find a woman who is suitable for this mission. Since this is the base of the terrorists, the most important thing is to dispel their suspicion. We need a person who will never be suspected by them, and Feng Ling absolutely meets the requirements of this mission in terms of body shape and psychological quality. He can definitely disguise as a woman to do this." Hearing this, Li Nanheng's eyes turned cold. Xiao Su immediately said, "In fact, it's not very reliable to pretend to be a woman. I just said it casually. Those terrorists have seen all kinds of women. It's best to find a real woman." As soon as he finished speaking, several drill masters next to him tugged at his sleeves, telling him to shut up quickly and reminding him to look at the faces of the military leaders. Li Nanheng directly closed the computer in front of him, picked up the silver lighter on the side, and played with it casually. From time to time, the crisp sound of the ignition and extinguishment and the small flame seemed to reveal a hint of hostility. The man's slender and well-defined fingers were also cold on the silver lighter. "He is not suitable." Li Nanheng tilted his head, and his eyes were very firm. "Change the candidate." No one said a word. Everyone knew that Feng Ling was indeed a very suitable candidate for this operation, but boss had said it, so no one could say anything more. But the military leader said, "Mr. Li, our operation is to encircle and suppress the terrorists who have threatened the safety of the president for many years. 11 base is set up here to be ready to sacrifice at any time. Every member of the base knows that there is a possibility of losing his life in a dangerous mission. If Mr. Li cherishes his members and is afraid that they will be in danger, what's the point of setting up this base here?" Li Nanheng threw the lighter in his hand back on the table coldly and asked in a very indifferent voice, "The US military and police forces add up to tens of millions of people. They are fully staffed, but the members of 11 base have to risk their lives again and again. I also want to ask, what's the point of your existence? You." The military leader's face instantly darkened. He suppressed his anger and said, "This is the order of the higher-ups. In dealing with terrorists, isn't the position of 11 base in the United Nations as the hardest shield in front? So the people I have carefully cultivated should die in vain?" Li Nanheng's eyes were as cold as a cold pool, cold and piercing. "Let me think about this matter for a while. I will make reasonable arrangements before the mission tomorrow." The military leader smiled coldly and turned to look at Feng Ling. "It's time to make contributions to the United Nations. Feng Ling, I just want you to disguise as a seemingly weak and harmless woman, sneak into a bar run by the terrorist leader in the red light district of Los Angeles to spy on the enemy, cooperate with us to encircle and wipe out their leader, and at the same time overturn their bar and hidden base lair. This kind of thing only requires you to disguise as a woman. It should not be difficult." Feng Ling roughly understood what they were talking about. Now that she heard the words of the military leader, she understood what they were talking about just now. She didn't say anything but turned to look at Li Nanheng. Li Nanheng narrowed his eyes, put one hand on the conference table, and looked at Feng Ling with dark eyes. Just as Feng Ling was about to speak, Li Nanheng said coldly, and his words were piercingly cold, "She is just a newcomer, not suitable for this operation. I will arrange another candidate. There is no need to be so anxious to decide on her directly." At the same time, he looked at her coldly. "Get out. Dash." Chapter 837. The military leader said with a faint smile, "Mr. Li, you have always cooperated with us in these operations, and you have always been serious and thoughtful. The United Nations and the higher-ups have always been very satisfied with 11 base, but even if 11 base is a unique existence that we can't afford to offend, there are still people from the United Nations above us. No matter how influential the Li family is, its lifeline is still in the hands of the United Nations. If you delay this operation because of your selfishness, if the higher-ups are unhappy, they may revoke the power of the base or dismiss you, Mr. Li, which is not worth the loss." Li Nanheng was not threatened by these words at all. He said word by word, and his cold eyes could almost freeze people to death. "No matter who is above us, even if it is the king, since 11 base is in my hands, the arrangement of the mission members is up to me. The military can only assist in the operation and has no right to interfere with any decision made in my base." The military people instantly fell silent, but everyone could feel that the temperature in the conference room of the base could not return to normal. No one dared to look at the military leader and Boss Li. They were really like an iceberg and a cold pond. Feng Ling was not afraid of death, but when she heard the words of the military leader, she probably knew the importance of this mission. She was not stupid. She could tell that Boss Li didn't want her to take risks, but she didn't know why he didn't want her to take risks, so she just said, "If you need me, I'm happy to cooperate with you. As a member of 11 base, I shoulder the mission of the base. Even if it is a mountain of knives or a sea of fire, I can do it." The pen that Xiao Su had been holding in his hand almost broke. He raised his hand to touch his chin and didn't speak, but he suddenly felt a little sad in his heart. Boss Li was not just protecting Feng Ling's life. Everyone knew that Boss Li had a bad temper, but he was still respected and awed by everyone. As long as it was a member of his base, he clearly remembered every life, unlike those people on the military side who only used 11 base as a life-saving meat shield and hid behind it. Although they were always at the front, the one standing at the front was always Boss Lee himself. Perhaps because of Nanheng's cold eyes, Feng Ling felt a chill in her bones. She said, "Of course, the premise is that Boss Lee gives the order. If Boss doesn't give the order, no one in the entire base is qualified to act on their own." Xiao Su faintly raised his eyebrows, thinking, "Feng Ling, you still have some desire to live. Otherwise, if you really go against Boss Lee in front of the military leader, I'm afraid you won't be able to see tomorrow's sun." Li Nanheng's expression didn't change at all. His voice was cold, and he only said 3 words, "Get out." After receiving 2 consecutive scram, Feng Ling did not speak anymore and turned to leave. When Feng Ling's figure disappeared from the conference room, the head of the military smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. He just said, "When 11 base was established, the older generation really lacked foresight. They should have trained some brave and resourceful women in the base instead of only accepting men. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had to take the risk of dressing up as a woman just to find a man of suitable height and appearance." The military leader paused and then said, "Of course, if this mission fails or there is any danger, I'm afraid the elders of the Li family will have to take the blame." At the beginning, they were very firm in opposing the idea of letting women enter the base. In this era, there is no difference between men and women. When a woman is smart and powerful, she is no worse than a man. Besides, this kind of mission that requires a seemingly fragile woman to explore the way can really show what a fatal decision the elders of the Li family and the founder of 11 base made. The Chinese value men over women is also reflected in the elders of the Li family. Li Nanheng glanced at the person in charge of the military and said, "Since the U.S. military and police value women so much, why can't they even find a qualified woman for this operation? Why do they have to go to 11 base and disguise themselves as women?" The military leader paused and his eyes suddenly turned cold. "As far as I know, there are a lot of strong women in the Los Angeles military base. I've seen several women mixed in with the personnel in the previous operations, but they don't seem to be of much use. Since you don't have the stubborn thinking of the older generation, why don't you offer them to us? This is your 11 base's business. You are responsible for fighting and supporting, and we are only responsible for cooperation. I can't decide the personnel deployment. Since the higher-ups have assigned the mission to you, of course, it's up to you to choose," the military leader said coldly. The king-like man sitting in the middle of the conference table tilted his head, and a cold gleam flashed across his deep black eyes. "Since it's up to us to choose, who gave you the right to assign people here just now? Those cowards who hide behind 11 base for everything are really brave when it comes to fighting back. You..." Without waiting for the military director to speak, everyone in the conference room watched the cold and picturesque man pick up the computer on the table with one hand, get up, and walk out. What's going on? Mr. Li has always been very polite to the military. Why does he seem to be very unhappy this time? I don't know. Maybe it's because the military leader dares to provoke us every time he comes. He really thinks that our 11 base is just following orders and that our boss is easy to deal with. If it weren't for the fact that the elders of the Li family insisted on keeping 11 base in the United Nations, Boss Lee would have already fallen out with them. TSK, these people are really embarrassed. If it weren't for 11 base, I don't know how many people would have died in so many dangerous missions. Yes, there is an old saying that 2 tigers cannot share a mountain. The U.S. military has long been displeased with 11 base. After all, most of the power in their hands has been divided up by 11 base. They gave us so many missions that were obviously fatal, and we did them well without suffering any losses. However, they still asked us for such an operation this time and even gave us such a difficult task. They are really shameless to the extreme. There was a whisper in the base conference room. Chapter 838. It was late at night, and Feng Ling's sleeping time was fixed. At 10 o'clock, she lay down to rest. All of a sudden, her cell phone rang. She took a look at it and saw that it was a message from Xiao Su. He asked her to go downstairs and said he had something to talk to her. Feng Ling turned to look out of the window. The light in the room next door hadn't been turned on all night. She picked up a coat, put it on, and went out. When she went downstairs, Xiao Su was waiting for her outside the door, holding a cigarette that was about to burn out. It seemed that he had been waiting downstairs for a while. Brother Su. Feng Ling walked over. Xiao Su threw the cigarette but in his hand down, raised his foot to crush it, and said in a low voice, "What do you plan to do about what you heard in the conference room?" Feng Ling, I don't have any plans. I'll listen to the arrangements of the base. If they want me to go, I'll go. Xiao Su smiled. You're really straightforward. It's obvious that the military deliberately made things difficult for you, but you're too simple. You don't know the private grievances between the US military and our 11 base. What grievances? When the elders of the Li family were in charge of our 11 base, we were already very powerful and almost threatened the prestige and status of the US military. In the United Nations, we were also a high-profile force. In recent years, under Boss Li's leadership, we have become more and more powerful, and for many years, 11 Base has sent a lot of people to the military and the police. You know very well the training methods of our 11 Base. As long as we can get out of the base, we will definitely attract jealousy, so those who are separated from the base have been secretly ostracized by the military and the police. In recent years, 11 Base has sent out a lot of tasks, big and small, to us. Many tasks that the military can't complete have been assigned to us, causing us to become more and more famous. The purpose of the military is to let 11 Base take the lead and weaken our combat power, but 11 Base has let them down again and again. Now these tasks that the head of the military has arranged for us, although they say it's arranged by the United Nations, in fact, it's also related to their secret tricks. They have been looking for opportunities to catch 11 Base's weakness. The situation of the military being divided up by 11 Base makes them uneasy. Now seeing that the base is getting stronger and stronger, they have more and more bad ideas. Feng Ling listened quietly and didn't speak. As we said in the conference room, we really need a girl who is agile but looks weak and won't attract the enemy's attention, but there is no suitable candidate in the base. I suddenly said that because I saw you in women's clothes last time and thought that if you disguised as a woman, you would be safe, but I ignored boss's thoughts. He doesn't want you to take this risk at all. After all, this time the military is here to let the people of 11 Base die. It will be dangerous for anyone to go. Boss doesn't want you to go. Feng Ling raised her eyebrows. We are all members of the base. We can't refuse the mission. It's the same no matter who goes. Why doesn't boss want me to take this risk? Xiao Su's expression changed and he suddenly whispered, Are you really stupid or pretending to be stupid? Feng Ling looked at him in confusion. Xiao Su simply leaned close to her and said in a low voice, Can't you see Boss Li's feelings for you? Which member of the base has he been so concerned about? Boss really attaches great importance to you. To put it bluntly, Boss just likes you. Feng Ling was dumbfounded. But I am a man. So what? In today's world, gender is no longer an obstacle. Although Boss is very restrained, those of us who often hang around him can see that he definitely has special feelings for you. This time, he won't let you die. After Boss left the conference room, he didn't show up again, but I heard that he is reorganizing the elites in the base. This kind of thing that may cost his life, I guess he still plans to do it himself. Speaking of this, Xiao Su sighed. The terrorists we are going to deal with this time are all a group of people who are extremely lustful. In my opinion, it's the safest way to use a woman to seduce them. Boss, because of the responsibility of 11 Base and the reputation of the elders of the Li family, can't let you take the risk. He would rather sacrifice himself. I really don't feel at ease, so I came to talk to you. When Feng Ling heard Xiao Su said that Boss Li liked her, her mind was in a mess. When she heard that Boss Li was going to sacrifice himself, she immediately asked in surprise, Is boss going to dress up as a woman? The corner of Xiao Su's mouth twitched. Do you think such a tall man can't see that he is a man in women's clothes? Do you think everyone is like you? It's really difficult to distinguish a man from a woman when he wears women's clothes. Feng Ling, she paused and then said, since 11 Base doesn't have to completely obey the arrangement of the military, can't we communicate with the higher-ups about this kind of mission? Do we have to take the risk? What does the military do? Is it just a decoration watching coldly from the sidelines? Xiao Su sighed. How can boss be suppressed by the military, but the base has its mission? 11 Base is the hard work of the elders of the Li family for decades and the lifeblood of the Li family. He will not easily compromise, but he can't let the reputation of 11 Base be ruined by those people. He must do what he should do, even if it may cost his life, but which mission is easy and safe? There is no most dangerous mission, only more dangerous. With that, Xiao Su shook his head again. In fact, I said so much just to tell you that boss is actually considerate of everyone except himself. In this situation, Feng Ling, although boss doesn't allow you to participate in the mission, I think you can really play a vital role this time. Whether boss and the elites in our base can come back safely or not depends on you. Feng Ling nodded and said, Feng Ling, I don't want you to participate in the mission. Seeing that Feng Ling didn't speak anymore, Xiao Su suddenly turned around, walked into the door, and took out a bag at the bottom of the stairs. I was afraid it would be too abrupt, so I didn't hold it in my hand. Since I've said so much, I'll give it to you. It's up to you whether to go or not. I'll text you the location of the mission gathering place later. Chapter 839. Feng Ling didn't know what was in the bag. Why did Xiao Su ask her out so mysteriously and specially give it to her? He weighed the bag in his hand and opened it to take a look inside. After seeing what was inside, he immediately closed the bag with a slightly hot face. He then looked at the back of Xiao Su, who had already walked far away, and turned around to go upstairs with the bag. Back in the room, she looked at the bag in her hand again and poured all the things inside on the bed. It was a white dress with a fashionable and beautiful design, and it was a suspender skirt. There was a circle of white translucent lace that looked particularly cute at the bottom of the skirt. More importantly, there was a set of nude women's underwear. The cup of the underwear was at least C cup. It didn't look too big on her body, but it also wasn't small enough to make people suspicious. And a pair of incredibly soft silicone flesh-colored things. To put it simply, he was afraid that she wouldn't look like a woman after putting on clothes, or that she would put too exaggerated water balloons in like last time, so he bought her a pair of silicone fake breasts. Where on earth did Xiao Su go to buy these things? This pair of fake breasts felt so soft and elastic as if they were real. Okay, Feng Ling picked up the pair of fake breasts and looked at it. She pinched it twice in her hand, and it felt so good that she almost blushed. There was a box in the bag that didn't fall out. She took out the box and opened it. She saw a pair of high heels and flesh-colored stockings that looked extremely sexy. Including a waist-length, slightly curly, wavy black wig, the hair looked soft and natural, not fake at all. There seemed to be something at the bottom of the box. Feng Ling touched it with her hand and took out a lipstick, a small box of 3-color eyeshadow, and mascara from a thin layer of paper below. Looking at all the things spread on the bed, Feng Ling, Xiao Su was really a talent to be able to buy so many things. The next day, the tall black Hummer galloped in the area where several helicopters were parked and stopped in the middle. Li Nanheng got out of the car and began to arrange their actions one by one. He picked up the walkie-talkie and explained other matters to the people in the helicopter who could not come out for the time being. Just when they were about to set off after checking the number of people, a black off-road vehicle that the members of 11 Base could drive away in an emergency suddenly came from another direction and stopped steadily 1 meter away from the man in a black uniform and black military boots. Li Nanheng looked at the car that suddenly stopped beside him. There was a protective layer on the window, so he couldn't see the person inside. He just stared at the car and didn't speak immediately. He slowly put down the walkie-talkie in his hand and looked expressionlessly at the car door that was opened at this time. At the moment when Feng Ling stepped out of the car, the elites of the base around all widened their eyes in disbelief, only to see a pair of slender legs wearing slender and sexy little high heels appear in their sight. Then they slowly looked up and saw a slender and graceful girl with waist-length hair, wearing a white dress that looked pure and sexy, standing directly by the car door. This girl's figure was strange to everyone, but the face with light makeup and even a thin layer of lipstick shocked everyone. It was Feng Ling. Feng Ling was dressed as a girl, and when she got out of the car and closed the door, she was charming and handsome, and then she threw the car key into Li Nanheng's arms. At the moment when the man instinctively caught the electronic car key, she smiled at him. "Boss, if I don't come, won't it be a waste of the combat power of the elites of the base?" After about 5 seconds, Li Nanheng finally spat out a few words. Li Nanheng finally spat out a few words. "Who asked you to come here?" Feng Ling smiled. "Yesterday, I heard it clearly in the conference room. The best strategy for this operation is to find someone to dress up as a woman and sneak into the bars run by terrorists at night to wait for an opportunity to act. Although it is really difficult for a man to dress up as a woman, as a member of the base, I can't absolve myself from the blame. Boss, please don't ask me to go back with the reason that I am a newcomer. I am a member of the base, and I will die as the soul of the base. It's not my style to be a coward. Anyway, it's not the first time that I've dressed up, but this time I just put on a pair of silicone fake breasts. It's okay." After speaking, Feng Ling deliberately straightened her waist and raised her hand to make a gesture in front of her chest. She didn't need the pair of fake breasts that Xiao Su bought for her at all. She just needed to untie the chest wrapping cloth, and the C-cup underwear would be just right for her. But in order not to arouse suspicion, she raised her hand and simply rubbed and pinched her chest. To be honest, now this thing made of silicone is more real than the real one. Wasn't it more real than the real one? A group of elites of the base standing nearby watched Feng Ling rubbing her chest, and their mouths went dry. This was too real, and this body proportion. Was Feng Ling really a man? Li Nanheng also heard what she said and looked at her movements. Even if you are willing to sacrifice your face for the base and are willing to dress up as a woman, I don't seem to have assigned you a task. Who gave you the courage to disobey the orders of your superior and act on your own initiative during a mission? At this moment, the man's tone was completely that of a superior, and there was not the slightest bit of warmth. Feng Ling approached him until she stood in front of the man. The faint fragrance of the girl, or the boy's, body spread into the man's nose again. He quietly glanced at her clothes that didn't seem out of place. At such a close distance, he couldn't see which part of her body looked fake. Instead, only a thin black hair clip in her hair betrayed her. He could tell that this long hair was fake, but the rest was really terrifying. "Boss Li, you also know that when I was hospitalized, I had already familiarized myself with all the rules and regulations of the base. I know the price of acting on my own initiative, but now, the mission is ahead. After all of us safely return, boss can punish me. I will definitely bear all the consequences and will definitely not find any excuse for myself." Feng Ling stood in front of the man and curved her pink and tender lips. She stood very, very close to him, and her voice was clear and clean. It seemed that because of this dress, even her voice sounded almost like a girl's, making one's body go soft. Because of her approach, Li Nanheng quietly watched her face, his gaze inadvertently swept over her chest, and slowly narrowed his eyes. Chapter 840. Because of her approach, Li Nanheng looked at her face calmly, glanced at her chest inadvertently, and slowly narrowed his eyes. Fake. Feng Ling was wearing a white suspenders skirt. When she put on this skirt after changing into her underwear, she found that the cleavage on her chest was too obvious. At a glance, she knew it was not fake, so she added a tight-fitting suspenders inside to cover it a little. However, looking from top to bottom, it still looked very real. It didn't look like a pair of silicone gels had been added to a flat chest at all. She smiled. Boss, do you want to poke it with your hand to see if it really feels so real? Li Nanheng glanced at her face and looked at her eyes that were not timid but shining. He looked away expressionlessly and didn't touch it. He just threw the electronic car key back into her arms. Go back to the base. The man was tall and his tone was heavy. Because the girl in front of him looked very thin and petite, such a visual contrast made him even more imposing. Feng Ling placed the key in her hand and played with it casually. Her voice was so low that only he could hear her. I've already made such a big sacrifice. Boss, do you want to treat me like a piece of trash and drive me back to the base in public? Everyone knows that if I participate in this matter, the problem will be much simpler. It's better to use wits than force. Who says that I will really die if I sneak into a bar dressed like this? Li Nanheng didn't move but just stood there, looking at the girl in front of him. The group of people waited by the side. They felt that there seemed to be something in Boss's eyes when he looked at the girl, Feng Ling, but it seemed that he had been restraining something. When they wanted to take a closer look, they found that Boss Li's expression was only cold and didn't look like what they thought. You're not going back? Li Nanheng looked at her firm face and asked coldly, do you know what kind of experience you will face if you sneak into that kind of bar dressed like this? Feng Ling paused and her eyes flickered. Anyway, I am a man. What kind of experience can I face? I'll just adapt to the situation. Hearing this, Li Nanheng's cold eyes suddenly lit up with a terrible flame. If you don't have full confidence, you don't have to go. If you go, you will drag everyone down. You'd better not go. I won't drag anyone down. Once I find the situation is not good, I will find a way to protect myself as soon as possible. Of course, if I can't protect myself. Feng Ling stared into his eyes. I know the rules of 11 base. I would rather die than be humiliated. Even if I die with them, I won't be suppressed by them and become your burden. Boss, you can rest assured. Seeing that she was too determined, Li Nanheng looked at her face with light makeup and her lips that looked even more pink because of the thin lipstick. He reached out to pinch her chin, carefully looked at her face, and slowly said, almost biting his words, you look like this now. Fortunately, you are a man in your bones. Otherwise, would definitely let you have a taste. Before he finished speaking, he paused when he saw Feng Ling's exposed white shoulders in the suspenders dress. Feng Ling didn't understand what he meant. Taste what? Taste what? Of course, let Feng Ling taste the consequences of disobeying orders. If it was a man, he would punish him until he cried on the training ground. If it was a woman, he would punish her until she cried on the bed. Li Nanheng looked away expressionlessly and said coldly, today's mission can only be successful. You don't have to die with them. Everyone must return to the base safely. Seeing that he allowed her to go with him, Feng Ling immediately smiled, raised her hand, and gave a standard salute of 11 base. Got it. Looking at the girl in front of him, who seemed to be delicate and charming, with a bit of a heroic spirit that other women didn't have, and looking at the flower-like smile on the girl's face, Li Nanheng suddenly noticed the wolf-like eyes around him. He turned to see that the elites of the base were staring at Feng Ling's figure and bare shoulders, and he glanced at her coldly. Is your uniform in the car? Take it off and put it on. It was a cold and commanding tone. I didn't bring my uniform. Didn't I dress up as a woman? In order to make it more realistic and not arouse the enemy's suspicion, I don't even have a gun on me. How could I bring my uniform out? Li Nanheng's gaze gradually turned cold. He abruptly took off his black uniform jacket and forcibly put it on her back. Then, as though he was only helping her put on the jacket, he pulled her into his arms. Feng Ling was not used to wearing high heels. She staggered forward and leaned into his arms uncontrollably. The tip of her nose bumped into his strong chest through the black t-shirt. The faint cool scent of the man's body, mixed with the unique minty scent of tobacco, instantly lingered in her nose. Feng Ling stiffened and didn't move. Feeling the strength of the man when he helped her put on the jacket and his breath on her head, Her ears kept echoing with Xiao Su's words. Can't you see Boss Li's feelings for you? Has he ever cared so much about any member of the base? Boss really values you. To put it bluntly, Boss just likes you. Boss likes you. Feng Ling couldn't help glancing up. At this moment, Li Nanheng helped her zip up the incredibly large uniform, pushed her forward, and said coldly, "Get in the car." The car Feng Ling drove was not suitable for the mission site, so she could only follow their car or helicopter. She quickly came back to herself, nodded, and turned to get into the black Hummer next to her, Li Nanheng. The elites of the base who were still standing around gossiping, immediately withdrew their gossipy expressions when they saw Li Nanheng's gaze. They all got ready and quickly boarded the helicopter, ready to set off. In the car. Boss, isn't it too obvious to dress like this? Feng Ling sat in the passenger seat. Probably because she was wearing a skirt, she couldn't sit as casually as usual. She sat there with her legs together, looking more like a little girl. Li Nanheng glanced at her lightly. Take it off after we arrive at the mission site. Who bought you a skirt? Why are you so exposed? Do you need to show so much when you're dressed as a woman? Feng Ling. Maybe it's to look more real. Chapter 841. Real. It was really King real. If it weren't for the fact that he had something to do, when he saw Feng Ling dressed like this in such an unguarded situation, he would definitely get hard again in front of her. Feng Ling didn't look at Li Nanheng who was driving. She usually wore such a black uniform, but she had never worn anyone else's uniform. She really didn't expect that Boss Li's uniform would be so big on her now. She felt that this uniform was so big that it could directly cover her buttocks, and the cuffs had to be rolled up several times to show her hands. She was like a child who stole adults' clothes. She rolled up her sleeves as she said, "When we arrive at the destination, I'd like to ask Boss to give me a few pointers about tonight's mission. I suddenly cut in the middle of the queue, so I don't know the specifics. You have to tell me exactly what to do when the time comes." As she spoke, Feng Ling had already rolled up her sleeves, but the cuffs were also very wide. When she spoke, she raised her hands, and the wide cuffs swayed. Her fair and tender arms directly shook the man's eyes. What? The man directly looked away, no longer looking at her, and drove expressionlessly. Feng Ling's task sounded very simple, but in fact, once it was exposed, she would instantly die in the bar. She needed to pretend to be a barmaid in the bar, accompany the leaders of the terrorists to drink in the private room at night, inquire about their plans, and at the same time be prepared to cooperate with them from both inside and outside, waiting for the opportunity to directly kill their leader or directly capture him. For the sake of her safety, Li Nanheng didn't let her capture the terrorist leader alone inside, but only asked her to be prepared to protect herself and cooperate with them from both inside and outside. However, Feng Ling was more or less aware of the nature of this mission. If she could get the best opportunity, it would be better to capture the leader of this terrorist group alive. In this way, she could get more information from him, which would be of great help to either side. Before sneaking into the bar, the base had arranged in advance the only spy in the bar, because this kind of place seemed to be open to the public, but in fact, some of the private rooms inside were not accessible to any hostess, and not everyone could casually sit next to those people and listen to them. Without the cooperation and arrangement of the spy inside, she couldn't get in at all. The spy arranged by 11 base inside was a very fair-looking bartender about 20 years old. He looked very simple, but he was so agile that even Feng Ling was a little surprised, and he reacted very quickly to any situation. In less than half an hour, he successfully brought Feng Ling into the bar, avoided everyone's sight, and didn't arouse anyone's suspicion. Feng Ling didn't need to change her clothes. She only needed to put on a thicker lipstick. When the bartender saw her overly plain appearance, he said that although she looked like a woman, none of the hostesses here would be so plain. Thus, he found a small gold necklace and some good-looking bracelets for her to wear. Feng Ling didn't know where to put them on, but she didn't know why. After Feng Ling put on the bracelets, the bartender directly made an okay gesture to her, Obviously, her current dress looked quite foolproof. Before entering the private room, Fong Ling had already known that the primary targets of today's task were the two most important leaders of this group of terrorists. One of them had a very easy-to-remember and common name, named David, who was a black African, and the other was named Paul, who was Russian. David was the real boss, but Paul was a very sharp person. He was equivalent to the most powerful strategist around the boss, and he was the one that needed to be guarded against and treated with caution the most. The rest of the terrorists present came from all over the world, but most of them communicated with each other in English, but there might be some secret codes that others couldn't understand. Fong Ling needed to distinguish the meaning of those secret codes by herself, so that she could cooperate with the people of 11 base outside. After getting all the information, it happened to be the time when the group of people arrived at the bar to talk in the evening. At 8:30 p.m. many people came into the bar one after another. Fong Ling sat at the bar counter, holding a goblet in her hand. It seemed to be wine, but in fact, it was a fruit wine with a very low alcohol content made by the bartender according to her drinking capacity. However, from a distance, it looked like a very strong whiskey and smelled the same. The lights in the bar shone on everyone randomly. Fong Ling sat in front of the bar casually and seductively, talking and laughing with the people standing inside from time to time. The bartender often appeared beside her at the right time, reminding her who had just come and whether all the people had arrived or not. David was violent and bloody, but he was particularly fond of women. Every time he came to the bar to talk about business, he would specially invite the hostesses arranged by the bar to drink with him. This time was no exception. The manager of the bar had investigated the situation of every hostess here, so he was very reassured. However, the bartender took advantage of the fact that the manager didn't notice and put Fong Ling into the team of those women. Anyway, these women were usually separated and were not allowed to contact in private, so they were not particularly familiar with each other. Fong Ling walked into the private room, and the first thing she saw was that there were more than a dozen people sitting inside, including black, yellow, and white skin. The man sitting in the middle was dark all over and holding a cigar in his mouth. He was the leader of the terrorists, David. She had seen his photo in Boss Lee's car just now and recognized the more important people among them, such as David, Paul, and 2 or 3 other people who could be considered leaders. It was they who bombed a plane in New York half a month ago, attacked a TV station in the United States, broke into the live broadcast room during the live broadcast, and shot the news anchor in front of tens of millions of TV viewers. Then they sat there and announced that they would infiltrate every corner of the United States, and their ultimate goal was the residence of the president. This group of people was very arrogant. But it was undeniable that every group of terrorists derived from the United States, no matter large or small, was very bold, and they were all desperados who didn't care about life and death at all. Chapter 842. When she saw a good empty seat, she walked over. "Are you new here? Don't you know the rules?" Paul saw a young girl in a white dress walking towards a less crowded area after entering the door. He immediately looked in her direction suspiciously. Fong Ling turned to look at him, lowered her head, and stood there with an uneasy expression. "Come sit here." Paul patted a very narrow empty seat next to him. Fong Ling walked over without hesitation. When she walked up to him and was about to sit next to him, her wrist suddenly tightened. The yellow-haired man sitting on the sofa looked frighteningly thin but shrewd and decisive, directly pulled her onto his lap. As soon as Paul sat on his lap, the expression on her face didn't change. When he was about to lift her chin to take a closer look, she quickly reached out to pick up the wine glass on the coffee table, poured a glass of wine, and fed it to his mouth, saying coquettishly, "Sir, drink." The warm and fragrant jade in his arms and this coquettish voice instantly made Paul's bones soften. Earlier, he was a little suspicious, but when she sat down, the natural fragrance emitted by the girl's body and her attractive figure made Paul not do anything particularly sharp. He just drank the wine in her hand and then held her white and tender little hand to rub it. Fong Ling maintained a smile on her face. However, when Paul touched the 2 thin calluses on her palm, which were slightly worn out because of years of training to hold a gun. He immediately glanced at her eyes, pinched her hand, and said with a smile, "Such a beautiful and delicate beauty, why do such things grow in your hands?" Feng Ling didn't panic at all. "Sir, because my family is poor. I have been helping my parents with housework and going out to do business since I was a child. My hands have touched too many things, so they have thin calluses. If my family is rich, why would I run out to be a bartender? Sir, you won't despise me because of my hands, will you? If my family is rich, who will come out to drink every night?" "Really?" Paul looked at her smiling eyes and stroked her soft and slender waist through her white dress. When he almost touched her chest, the smile on Feng Ling's face did not diminish at all. Before his hand touched her, she turned to pour a glass of wine, dodged his hand, and fed it to his mouth. After feeding him a few glasses, Paul was not drunk at all. Instead, he asked Feng Ling to drink as well. He even asked the waiter to bring in several kinds of stronger alcohol. Every time he opened a bottle, he poured a glass for Feng Ling to taste. Feng Ling rarely drank, so her alcohol tolerance was naturally low. 1 or 2 glasses of this kind of wine were enough to knock her out. After she reluctantly drank a few glasses, her face was already red, but since she was a bartender, she would definitely be suspected if her alcohol tolerance was too low. She took the opportunity to walk away from Paul's lap and sit next to him. While they were sitting in the private room talking, she tried to shake off the feeling of drunkenness and remembered all the contents of their conversation in her heart. About 40 minutes later, Feng Ling's brain could hardly maintain such a sober state. When David and Paul talked about an important topic, Paul suddenly thought of her. He poured a glass of wine and handed it to her. "Come on, have another glass." Feng Ling looked at the glass of wine with her sober eyes, hesitated when she put it to her mouth, and only took a sip before putting down the glass. "I want to go to the bathroom first," she said. Paul didn't stop her and looked at her. "Okay, I also want to go to the men's bathroom and the women's bathroom. After all, it's on the way. Shall I accompany you?" Feng Ling nodded shyly, got up, and walked out. Walking side by side with Paul in the dimly lit corridor of the bar, Song Yunxuan's pace seemed steady, but she was still a little unsteady. When they finally arrived at the door of the washroom, Song Yunxian hurriedly entered the ladies' washroom before Paul turned around to tell her anything. After finding a small cubicle, she quickly took out the hangover medicine that the bartender had prepared for her from the small leather bag that she had prepared temporarily. Without any water, she directly stuffed it into her mouth and swallowed it. Then, after standing in the room for 2 minutes, Feng Ling closed the small leather bag in her hand, turned around, and was about to open the door to go out, but her hand holding the door handle paused at this moment. Although she couldn't hear clearly, she vaguely felt that the atmosphere in the women's bathroom was a bit subtle. The effect of the antidote was not so fast, but at this moment, her heart was much calmer. She heard that Paul was a very smart person, but his martial arts skills were very ordinary. After calming down for a few seconds, she suddenly pushed the door open. Sure enough, as soon as she opened the door, she saw a black muzzle pointing at her head. She looked at Paul in panic and confusion at first, who was holding a gun in front of her. Although she tried to explain, Paul didn't intend to let her go. At the moment he pulled the trigger, Feng Ling, who lowered her head in fear, suddenly had a flash in her eyes. She kicked him hard on his knee at an unexpected speed, and with the advantage of her high-heeled shoes, she raised her foot and kicked him in the face when he fell to the ground. After kicking him into the cubicle of the bathroom, she grabbed his arm, bent it back hard, and knocked his head hard. Before he had time to struggle, she snatched the gun. She guessed that this gun couldn't be a silencer gun, so she couldn't shoot it here. She knocked Paul out with a chop, hid the gun in her skirt, and turned to walk out of the bathroom quickly. Tonight's action couldn't be delayed. Since Paul had already suspected her, it meant that others might have also suspected her. At the moment when Feng Ling rushed out of the bathroom, she seemed to hear a large number of people approaching in the distance. She paused, turned her eyes abruptly, and saw a man coming from another direction. "Boss Lee?" Wasn't he supposed to be waiting for backup outside? Why did he suddenly break in alone? Li Nanheng walked closer from the other side of the corridor. He had changed his clothes, and his shirt was half open. His black hair was like the arrogant ink-colored night, and his coldness made her heart instantly safe. However, as the footsteps of a large number of people approached, Feng Ling looked around and saw the place where Paul had fainted behind her. She was annoyed that there was no more suitable place to hide and avoid suspicion, but the man who had approached had already come up to her. Before she could react, he stretched out his long arm and took her into his arms. Feng Ling felt her waist tighten, and the next moment, she was quickly pressed against the wall next to the bathroom by the man, completely blocking her figure. She didn't understand what Boss Li was going to do. She opened her mouth to ask in a low voice, but the man in front of her suddenly bowed his head. She didn't know if it was because the antidote hadn't worked yet, but the man's strong aura made her a little dizzy. Then Li Nanheng lowered his head and suddenly kissed her. Chapter 843. The man suddenly lowered his head. Feng Ling's eyes suddenly widened, and her lips felt numb. The unhesitant, almost domineering kiss made Feng Ling stiffen, and she pressed her hands against the cold wall behind her. However, the man in front of her took advantage of the moment when she was absent-minded, opened her teeth, and fiercely kissed her. She was stimulated by the intense kiss and trembled. She subconsciously raised her hand to push him away, but the man hugged her even tighter and pressed her against the wall even more fiercely. There was no gap between their bodies, and in an instant, all her breath was taken away. After about 10 seconds, the footsteps of those people were getting closer and closer. Feng Ling raised her eyes to look at the man who was close to her and whose breath was entwined with hers. The expression on Li Nanheng's face did not change. Feng Ling was still sober, but because of his sudden kiss, she panicked. Without giving her any time to think, he held half of her face with his strong palms, bent down, and continued to kiss her more deeply. Those footsteps were getting closer and closer. At this time, Li Nanheng warned her with his eyes to cooperate and not to move. Feng Ling didn't expect that he would come to support her alone in this way. Of course, she didn't move. After all, she was still sober, but her whole body seemed to be almost out of her control at this moment. As her lips were tightly pressed against the man's warm and soft lips, and when they went deeper, they almost touched each other. She felt as if a basin of hot water had been poured over her head, from the top of her head to her limbs to the tip of her toes. There was no place that was not boiling. And her hands, which were pressed against the wall, seemed to be numb and unable to move at all. David and the others are still in the private room? The footsteps had come behind Li Nanheng. Several terrorists who had just rushed back from outside glanced fiercely at the people who were dancing crazily on the dance floor of the bar behind them. They were about to walk to the private room when they suddenly saw a man and a woman kissing at the door of the bathroom in front of the corridor. From this angle, they could only see that the woman who was pressed against the wall was very slender, as if she was completely pressed there and kissed by the man, and the man in the half-open black shirt was tall and straight, making people couldn't help but look at him. He should still be there. The time we agreed on was 8:30. He's almost an hour late now. He's probably still waiting for us to plan our deployment for this week. Another person whispered in the crowd, the bar's business has been particularly good recently. There are too many people coming and going. We still have to be careful and not let anyone see through us. They are all trash who run to the bar to drink and pick up girls. At most, they are all kinds of hooligans. Why do we need to guard against them? The man in the lead said as he walked quickly behind the people who were kissing by the wall. The dozen people behind him couldn't help but glance at the man and woman by the wall. At the moment when the eyes of the group of people fell in their direction, Li Nanheng's hand directly peeled off the shoulder strap on Feng Ling's shoulder, but he still pressed her against the wall very tightly. Although the important part of the girl's half-naked shoulder could not be seen, people could instantly see the charming fragrance between the two people by the wall, as if the two people were really trapped in kissing and passion, making people unable to see any stiffness or flaws. When almost everyone passing by behind looked carefully at Li Nanheng's back, Feng Ling finally understood. She raised her stiff hand that was pressed against the wall, reached forward, and hugged the man's waist tightly. At the same time, as if she couldn't help but pull the corner of his shirt under his belt, her hand also reached inside the man's shirt, randomly groping the man's perfect and strong abdomen and back. Young people nowadays are really open in the bar. Are they going to *CK people outside the bathroom? Ha ha ha, if it weren't for the fact that we're in a hurry, I think we could stand here for a few more minutes to watch the live broadcast. The group of people behind laughed and passed by. They didn't see any guns, knives, or suspicious objects on the two of them. Instead, it made their blood boil. They directly withdrew their gaze from them and did not pay attention to the open door of the women's bathroom. They chatted and laughed as they passed by. Although there were some thin calluses on Feng Ling's palm due to holding a gun for a long time, the girl's exceptionally soft, white, and tender little hand was still different from that of a man. The deliberate touch on the man's body was different from the usual fighting during training. It was incredibly soft. The purpose was to help her divert the attention of those terrorists. After all, there was no other safer hiding place here, but the touch on her waist made Li Nanheng's kiss, which was originally just for others to see, deepen uncontrollably. The soft and slender body in his arms could only obediently cooperate because she didn't know what he was going to do next. He took the opportunity to firmly open her teeth, hooked Feng Ling's tongue, and kissed her fiercely. Even his spurting breath became more and more uncontrollable with this kiss. His breathing became heavier and heavier, and his hand almost broke Feng Ling's waist in an instant. He held her tightly in his arms and leaned down to kiss her fiercely. Although she had heard the footsteps of the group of people walking away, Feng Ling immediately moved her hand away from Li Nanheng's waist and pressed it back against the wall. She didn't dare to move at first, but the man still didn't let her go after so long. She looked at him in confusion with her somewhat blurred and half-sober eyes. She wanted to speak, but her lips were covered by the man's. The kiss gradually deepened, and she felt pain and numbness on her lips. Feng Ling opened her mouth to speak, but the man took the opportunity to enter her mouth as if to swallow everything in her mouth. After confirming that those people had turned into the private room on the other side of the corridor, the other group of people inside would definitely be suspicious if they didn't see Paul return after such a long time. Feng Ling hurriedly raised her hand to push Li Nanheng away, but the man pressed her deeper against the wall, held her waist tighter, and kissed her lips harder. The feeling of being swallowed alive by a man almost instantly made Feng Ling shiver all over. She subconsciously wanted to push him away, but the man directly sucked on her lips as if punishing her. In an instant, she felt that her lips were about to swell. Chapter 844. Feng Ling shuddered and tried to struggle, but the man's hand was not too presumptuous. The moment he touched her chest, he felt that the pair of silicone gels she had stuffed inside were too real, and it felt too. Before the man could savor it carefully, Feng Ling bit his lips hard. He paused and looked deeply at the girl imprisoned in front of him. For a moment, he thought how good it would be if he was really a woman instead of pretending to be a woman. In that case, no matter whether she was 18 years old or not, no matter whether she was an adult or not, he would engrave his mark on her and make her his woman. However, this unrealistic idea had just sprouted in his mind when Feng Ling abruptly raised her hand and poked an acupoint on the side of his waist with her finger. Feng Ling was different from the other men in the base. She also had various tactics when it came to close combat. Other men had the least patience to learn the acupoints of the human body to find the enemy's weakness, but only Feng Ling had learned this unpopular course in the base comprehensively. Right now, the place where her finger was poking was a numbing acupoint on the side of his waist. As long as she exerted a little more force, half of his body would instantly feel a tingling pain. If she exerted any more force, half of his body would be numb for several days and he wouldn't even be able to hold the gun steadily. When the man kissed her and looked at her, Feng Ling also looked at him with warning eyes. The man closed his eyes and lingered on her lips for a few seconds before finally letting her go. The moment the man took a step back, Feng Ling quickly raised her hand and wiped her almost red and swollen lips harshly. Without saying anything, she didn't look at him anymore, turned around, and quickly walked back into the women's room. The mission was more important. Li Nanheng glanced at his lower body, stood where he was with a cold expression, and slowly exhaled in a way that Feng Ling couldn't hear clearly. His little brother, who had been moving frequently recently, seemed to be particularly disobedient, especially when Feng Ling was dressed in women's clothes. He composed himself and walked in. There was no one else in the women's room at this moment. Feng Ling walked in, opened a partition door inside, and gestured for him to see the person inside. Li Nanheng glanced at Paul, who had fallen unconscious by the toilet. Without guessing, he knew it was Feng Ling's masterpiece. You defeated their think tank in such a short period of time. Not bad. Feng Ling glanced at the man lying inside and said mildly, he's too smart for his own good. He's been suspecting me and thinking that he can kill me by following me out. Maybe it's because I look like a weak woman who doesn't have any skills that he dares to fight against me alone. At this point, Feng Ling continued, his skills are indeed terrible. Previously, when I found out that his skills were average, I thought he could at least fight a few times. I didn't expect him to be so terrible. No matter what, he's the brains of these terrorists. No matter what, he's also a schemer who plans to attack various places in New York. He really disappoints me. Li Nanheng sneered. Do you think all the think tanks in the world are as difficult to deal with as Mo Jingshan? Feng Ling didn't have a particularly deep impression of Mr. Mo, and for many years, she had only heard of his name in the base. She only knew that he often contacted Boss Lee and 11 Base, and that Mr. Mo had secretly helped a lot in many decisions and plans in the base. She heard from Kay that this Mr. Mo was between the underworld and the underworld, but his hands were clean, and he was Boss Lee's close friend. The Mo family had a powerful background. Although this Mr. Mo was young, he had a lot of influence in the American business world and the underworld. Even in the American underground arms trade, many mafias offered hundreds of millions of yuan just to buy his head. Although she hadn't seen him before, after hearing this name for so many years in the base, she was instinctively full of awe for this person. Kay and the others described Mr. Mo as the think tank and the big boss behind the scenes of 11 Base. Thus, Feng Ling instinctively feared the word think tank. She didn't expect that this Paul, who was called the think tank of the terrorists, was so weak. It was really an insult to this word. The terrorists we are dealing with now are not integrated with the largest terrorist group at present. They are just a small part of the side branch. They are brave but not astute. To put it simply, the real manipulator behind the terrorist group looks down on them and kicked them out. They work alone to make a living. Compared with those terrorist groups that can't be wiped out no matter how hard they try, this group of people is not so dangerous. As long as we deal with them properly, it's easy to catch them all. As Li Nanheng spoke, Feng Ling touched the gun hidden in her skirt and said in a low voice, I just took his gun. I should sneak into the private room to continue snooping. Should I bring this gun with me, or did they search you before you went in? Yes. Then take it with you. When they think of searching you again, our people have successfully come in. There won't be a problem. Keep it to protect yourself. Okay. After closing the door in the bathroom, Feng Ling tidied up her skirt and pulled up the straps that had just been pulled down by Li Nanheng. She didn't look at the man next to her. The two seemed to have a tacit understanding not to mention the kiss just now, as if nothing had happened. Before walking out of the bathroom, Feng Ling asked, Boss, didn't we agree that you and the brothers in the base will wait for my signal outside and then come in to support us? If you take the risk to come in like this, it will be very dangerous if you are discovered. After all, I am disguised as a woman, so the chance of being discovered is smaller. But you take the risk. Feng Ling actually wanted to ask him if he had suddenly come in because he was worried about her being alone inside. But the next words were swallowed by her throat and she didn't continue to ask. Li Nanheng knew what she wanted to ask and didn't answer her. When he walked to the door, he stepped aside to let her go out smoothly. At the moment when Feng Ling passed by, he glanced at her ear and said casually, "Your ear is red again." Feng Ling, she walked away expressionlessly toward the direction of the private room. After Feng Ling left, Li Nanheng silently looked at the dark direction at the end of the corridor in the distance, picked up his cell phone, and called the bartender hiding in the bar. "I'm in the bathroom. Send the clothes I prepared in advance over immediately." "Yes." Chapter 845. Li Nanheng took the clothes from his hands and reached for the exquisite buttons on his black shirt. He unbuttoned them one by one and changed into the clothes that the bartender had brought over. Then he said unhurriedly, "In 10 minutes, arrange for a circuit failure. I will enter the private room in 15 minutes. "Yes." Earlier, when Li Nanheng pressed Feng Ling against the wall, he pressed her down hard. The passers-by could only vaguely see a woman in a white dress, but there were so many people in white clothes in the bar that they couldn't tell which one it was. Thus, when Feng Ling walked into the private room again, the people who saw her knew that she was a hostess who went out with Paul. When they didn't see their companion return, they asked coldly in a hoarse voice, "Why did you come back alone?" Feng Ling answered softly, "That gentleman said his stomach was not feeling well and asked me to come back after I came out of the bathroom. He should be in the men's bathroom." After speaking, she obediently sat back in her original seat. The people who entered the private room later only looked at her suspiciously for a moment before continuing to talk about their topics and plans. Indeed, as Boss Lee said, although they mostly communicated in English, some important clues, locations, and time arrangements had special codes and pronouns that she didn't understand. However, she vaguely heard about the White House and other topics, so she knew that although they had secret codes, the things they were discussing this time were mainly related to the White House and the attack on the president. After listening for nearly 10 minutes, she finally connected their secret codes and all the clues together. They planned to fly a helicopter to the area above the White House on Friday afternoon and launch a bomb attack. Their people had already infiltrated the White House. Originally, the area near the White House could not be easily flown by any aircraft, but they had already taken control of the person in charge of that area and replaced it with their own people. Hearing this news, Feng Ling obediently sat by the side and drank. From time to time, she would smile and hand a drink to the man next to her, trying her best to maintain her identity as a hostess. However, Paul still didn't return. From the time he left with Feng Ling to the 10 minutes now, he had been gone for nearly half an hour. The chatter in the private room gradually died down. Their leader, David, had already glanced at Feng Ling, who had been chatting and laughing with the others. The others also looked at Feng Ling at the same time. There was no change in the atmosphere, but Feng Ling could vaguely feel the tension. However, they were still watching her. There was a smile on Feng Ling's face, and her expression did not change. She had just taken the hangover medicine and drank a few mouthfuls of wine, so it was not a big problem. She smiled as she gently placed the wine glass in her hand on the tea table. She then picked up a piece of watermelon from the fruit platter and took 2 bites. She smiled with a harmless expression on her face. Just when everyone was wondering if something had happened when Paul went out with her, the 2 men beside David had already reached into their clothes and were about to pull out their guns. Feng Ling glanced at their movements but acted as though she hadn't seen anything. She spat out the watermelon seed on her hand and gently placed it on a piece of tissue by the side. Her movements appeared slow and careful, as though she was unaware of the murderous intent in the air. All of a sudden, the music in the private room abruptly stopped, and the lights dimmed. This sudden darkness caused everyone to instantly become vigilant. What's going on? Is there a power outage? Or is there an ambush? Just as the voice fell, someone quickly picked up his phone and turned on the flashlight function on his phone. After a trace of light was restored in the private room, the other people next to him also took out their phones and did the same. Just when the light in the private room was enough to see everyone clearly, David turned to look at the young lady in the white dress. She didn't seem to have done anything in that instant of darkness. She only took out her phone with a flustered expression and fiddled with it in her hand. She also hurriedly turned on the flashlight function. Then she looked at them with a flustered expression and asked in a small voice, "Is there a power outage?" If this little girl in the white dress was really planted by someone or had some kind of conspiracy, she would definitely have done something in the few seconds of darkness just now. However, when they saw her unprepared expression and how she reached for her phone helplessly like everyone else, they instantly dispelled their suspicions. Since she hadn't returned for so long, something must have happened to Paul. However, the problem shouldn't be with this woman. Go and ask. David's hand was already in his pocket. He held on to his gun and was prepared to respond immediately if anything happened. The others also held their phones in one hand to illuminate the room and prepared to take out their weapons with the other. Someone stood up and went out to ask. The little bartender happened to be nearby. He hurriedly came in with his phone and bowed apologetically. Apologies. There's a problem with the wiring in the bar. The entire bar has been cut off. We've already contacted the nearest wiring repairman. Someone will be here to fix it immediately. Within 10 minutes, all the lights will be restored. Are you sure it's just a problem with the wiring? David was black. In this dark private room, with the light from all the phones, his body and facial features couldn't be seen clearly. Only a pair of cold and sharp eyes filled with killing intent stood out. At the same time, they sent chills down one's spine. It was as though a pair of eyes had appeared out of thin air in the darkness. It was extremely terrifying. Yes, it's been raining in Los Angeles for the past few days. It's likely that the wiring outside the bar is too old. You should know that all the buildings in this red light district have been around for many years. Those wiring will more or less be affected by such weather. Don't worry, the repairman will be here soon. It won't take too long. The little bartender finished speaking and directly picked up his phone to make a call. He urged, "Are they here yet? Hurry up." Fong Ling looked in the direction of the little bartender. Could it be that there was a plan that she didn't know about? Was there really something wrong with the wiring or what was going on? Just a few minutes after the little bartender finished the call, footsteps sounded from outside. Then, the little bartender anxiously said something. Afterward, a tall man dressed in the uniform of a certain Los Angeles electric company walked in with a wiring box on his back. Chapter 846. It was Li Nanheng. She only glanced at the man who had just walked in. The man did not look at her. Instead, he turned around very professionally to check the power control box inside the private room. At this time, the bartender also came in and explained with an apologetic smile, "Everyone, please wait a moment. It will be ready soon. The repairmen have arrived. There are also a few people who are going to check the main power supply of the bar. We specially called one of them over to check if the wires in this private room are burnt. It will be fixed soon." What a waste of time. An impatient voice came from the private room, and then a group of people stood by the sofa and stared at the back of the man squatting in front of the power control box. Even though Li Nanheng's clothes looked very professional, and even the way he opened the power control box was absolutely not a problem, but among the group of people who entered the private room, a few of them deliberately glanced at him when they passed by behind him. Staring at David's back under the light of the phone, one of them took a step back and slowly walked to David's back, whispering something in David's ear. David immediately glanced at the repairman again. Without speaking, he slowly raised his hand and made a gesture to move forward. In an instant, the people next to David took out their guns, lightened their footsteps, and slowly moved behind Li Nanheng. They were not sure if there was a problem with this person or if they had seen wrongly before, but they had already made full preparations. As long as this repairman made the slightest movement that would threaten them, they would immediately be shot to death, and there would be no room for resistance. The man who was checking the power control box kept shining the light of his cell phone on the wires and circuit boards inside, took out very professional tools from the box at hand, and unscrewed the plugs and connectors on the solder plates inside. He didn't look back as if he was unaware of the danger behind him. In order to see the situation inside the power control box more clearly, he even bent down, knelt on one knee, and stuck his head in to check. Seeing this repairman's professional posture, there didn't seem to be any problem. David stared at him coldly, playing with the gun in his pocket, and didn't ask his men to shoot immediately. After all, if it was really a repairman, the power must be restored immediately. When they first came here, they came in small groups to avoid detection. Now that there were so many of them here, it would be too much trouble and too obvious if they wanted to move somewhere else. If it wasn't a repairman, it meant that this person was very dangerous. Then they had to be even more careful. On the other side of the sofa, Feng Ling moved her eyes away from Li Nanheng's back and watched helplessly as those people pointed their guns at her. But now was not the time for her to send out a signal, and as long as she made any movements at this time, Boss Li's life would be instantly buried under those people's muzzles. While those people weren't paying too much attention to her, she turned to glance at the bartender. The bartender didn't say a word after seeing those people's actions. It was as if he was just protecting himself and wouldn't join hands with anyone else, nor was he anyone's informant. He just quietly retreated to the side. Seeing the bartender like this, Feng Ling received an invisible hint from him. Now was not the time to start a war. She needed to continue hiding, keeping calm, and continuing to act. However, there was still no sound coming from the washroom. It was likely that the bartender had found a way to close the washroom on this floor. No one could get in, and no one would be able to find Paul, who had fainted with blood all over his face. At this time, David tilted his head and lit another cigar. He put his hand in his pocket, his fingers on the butt of the gun, and his dark face looked in the direction of the repairman for a full 4 minutes. "It's not fixed yet?" David asked coldly at this time. His eyes were already clearly impatient. "Most of the problem lies in the main power supply. We need our people to connect the main power supply line before this place can be restored." The repairman, who was squatting there and changing the wire, did not look back. He directly answered, "But it's indeed because the wire was burned. I think there will be a burnt red wire in the circuit in every private room. I'll change this one first. After the main power supply is connected, everything will be fine." As he spoke, he took out a red power cord from the box. Seeing the red wire in his hand, the bartender finally shifted his gaze and glanced at Feng Ling from the corner of his eyes. After Feng Ling received his gaze, she first looked at the waist and abdomen of the nearest short man from the corner of her eyes. Feng Ling received the hint, slowly took a step back, leaned against the sofa, and glanced sideways at the short man's clothes. Just now, she noticed that there was a bulge on his waist. Now, after the bartender's hint, it seemed that the explosive device that these terrorists often use to spontaneously ignite and self-destruct in times of danger was tied to this man's body. Usually, their explosive device could spread within 100 meters, and a person with an explosive device on his body was enough to die with the people around him. In such a situation tonight, although they wouldn't seek death and would only think of ways to protect themselves, based on their usual habits, there would definitely be someone with such a thing on his body. In order to let all the members of 11 Base come in to support, she must be the one to remove the explosive device and ensure that all the members of 11 Base would not be destroyed here. This was the second task of her tonight. It was more important than the task of snooping because it concerned the safety of the members of the base and the degree of completion of this task. Li Nanheng had already begun to install the red wire. Feng Ling's hand was behind her back, and she slowly took out a very small but very sharp dagger hidden in her skirt. This was given to her by Boss Li when she returned to the private room. When she first came in, because he would search her body, she couldn't bring it with her. She was originally considering how to deal with the subsequent situation without a weapon on her, but in the end, not only did she get a gun from Paul, but also because Boss Li suddenly took the risk to come in, he gave her a dagger. Chapter 847. It was too dark in the private room, and all the cell phone lights were aimed at Li Nanheng. On the other side, Feng Ling stood in the dark. No one would know that in the blink of an eye, one of their companions had died in Feng Ling's hands. The short man didn't even have the chance to scream before his throat was severed. His eyes widened as he tried to call for help, but he couldn't make a sound at all. He stared at her for a few seconds before he lost the strength to reach out to his companions due to the pain and numbness in his back. He fell to the ground silently. The moment he fell, Feng Ling raised her hand to catch him. She did not care that the other party's blood had already stained her dress. She let the short man, who had already died silently, stand by her side in a trembling posture. Without arousing suspicion, she reached the dagger behind him, cut open his clothes, and slowly used the dagger to cut the wire on the explosive device on his waist. At the same time, she used the dagger to cut the detonator of the explosive device. After she was done, she slowly turned her gaze to the bartender standing by the door. The bartender caught her gaze and suddenly took a step back. The gazes of the dozen or so people in the private room immediately turned to look at him. Just as the bartender's back was partially exposed outside the door, a burst of music suddenly rang out from the dance floor of the bar. It seems that the power in the bar hall has been restored. The bartender said impatiently. Hurry up, install the wire now. Don't waste time. Everything was still going on in the dark. However, the smell of blood coming from the short man's body made the two closest companions discover the problem first. There's blood. Whose blood is it? Suddenly, the two people's cell phones shone in Feng Ling's direction. The moment they saw the obvious bloodstains on Feng Ling's white dress, the people in the private room immediately shifted their attention to her. Even the hand that had been holding the gun in his pocket instantly pulled out his gun. He pulled the trigger and aimed at the seemingly innocent and harmless girl standing there, but her white dress was mostly dyed red. Almost at the moment when Feng Ling attracted all the attention in the private room, the huge widescreen television screen in the private room suddenly flashed. The dazzling red and yellow light dazzled their eyes, and then the sound of electric current came from the speaker. Be careful. There's really an ambush. The man who was holding a gun beside David suddenly shouted at this moment. At this moment, Feng Ling dragged the short man covered in blood who had been standing beside her in front of her. While blocking their shots, she quickly and neatly took out a gun from her skirt and dodged the two men who were pouncing at her. She raised her leg and gave a fatal kick to the back of the man's neck. Then she turned her hand and fired, instantly killing two of them. He never expected that such a beautiful and slender woman would be so agile and fierce. David cursed in a low voice, and his eyes were bloodshot. Suddenly, all the targets in the room charged toward Feng Ling. In the blink of an eye, the man who had been squatting beside the power control box slowly put away the pliers and various tools in his hands. The people who had been surrounding him looked at him coldly and turned to look in the direction of the girl in the white dress who was able to avoid being surrounded by so many people. At the moment when their attention shifted slightly, Li Nanheng's hand suddenly pressed the red button in the power control box. In an instant, the corridor outside was still pitch black, but the private room suddenly lit up with dazzling red and yellow lights. At the same time, ear-piercing alarms kept ringing, loud enough for the people lurking outside the bar to hear instantly. The people in the private room were shocked by the sudden glaring light and the sound. They could only shout, "Not good," before they could finish their words. Their heads were suddenly hit hard, and they fell to the ground with blood flowing out of their heads. Li Nanheng knocked down the person closest to him, then grabbed another person's wrist and twisted it hard. There was a crisp sound of the wrist bone breaking. At the same time, he grabbed the gun and bent down to avoid the bullet shooting toward him. At the same time, he bent his other arm and used his elbow to attack the other person's abdomen. He then grabbed the shoulder of another person who was pouncing toward him, and with a backhand throw, he was ruthlessly thrown toward the group of people who were pouncing toward him. Catch! Li Nanheng took out a gun from his clothes with one hand, and at the same time, he threw the gun he had just snatched in his other hand toward the door of the private room. The bartender, who had been standing there, shivering, quickly caught the gun. In an instant, he shot and killed the person who was about to come over to seal the door. He then quickly walked in to help Feng Ling, who who was surrounded by a large group of people. Although Li Nanheng and the bartender had already attracted the attention of most of the people, the dozen or so people surrounding Feng Ling still did not give up. David, in particular, did not dare to believe that he had actually been schemed against by a little girl. He was enraged to the extreme. As a terrorist, he was not afraid of death, so he disregarded everything and continued to target her. The alarm kept ringing, causing them to feel annoyed. 11 Base had training on bright lights, so Feng Ling was not affected by the ear-piercing sound and the dazzling red and yellow lights. She looked at the dazzled people and smiled coldly. She shot one of them in the abdomen and took the opportunity to grab the other person's hair and throw him forward. When he fell beside the legs of the people who were rushing over, she raised her hand and fired several shots. However, these shots were all successfully avoided by them. She dodged and retreated again, but she was forced to the corner of the private room by them. Li Nanheng and the bartender dealt with the 7 or 8 people behind this group of people. When he saw Feng Ling's direction, Li Nanheng abruptly rushed over, grabbed one of them, and dragged him to the side. Bullets shot out from his hands, and the moment the elites of 11 Base rushed in, he took the lead to push the crowd away and pulled Feng Ling, who had been forced into a corner, into his arms. Feng Ling saw that the gun in David's hand was already aimed at her head, but she was suddenly pulled away by Li Nanheng. Her body was uncontrollably turned by the man, and her head instinctively leaned against Li Nanheng's chest. However, she suddenly heard the sound of a bullet grazing through flesh and blood, and then it shot past her ear, causing a strand of hair that was not covered by the wig to flutter. Chapter 848. As she spoke, she looked down and saw that there was a cut on the sleeve of the man's arm, which was wrapped around her back. "It's okay. Let's go." As if he couldn't feel the pain, Li Nanheng used his other uninjured arm to push Feng Ling hard into the crowd of elites of the base, turned around, kicked away the people who had already pounced on him, and raised his hand to shoot again. Feng Ling quickly regained her senses and went in with the people of the base to subdue the terrorists. Because the wig on her head was too much of a hindrance, she pulled off the wig and threw it hard on the enemy's face. Then she took advantage of the fact that the enemy couldn't see her and rushed forward to attack. While holding a bullet, she shot directly in David's direction. This shot hit David's back. David resisted the pain and turned around, but at the moment he turned around, Li Nanheng on the other side also shot at him. This shot hit his shoulder, and then Li Nanheng shot David's wrist that was holding the gun. At the same time, Feng Ling stepped forward, kicked away the man next to her, raised the gun, and shot both of David's legs. She and Li Nanheng tacitly didn't hit David's vital parts. He was the leader of these terrorists. It was better to keep him alive and hand him over to the military for interrogation. David fell to the ground. His arms and legs were already dripping with blood. He was in so much pain that his entire body twitched. He suddenly bit his tongue hard. Li Nanheng pushed the person who attacked him away with one hand. Because he could not free himself to go over, he gave Feng Ling a look from afar. Feng Ling nodded and stepped forward to pinch David's chin. She grabbed a plastic bag wrapped in tissue from the blood-stained coffee table and stuffed it into his mouth. She then kicked his abdomen hard. David immediately widened his eyes at her short hair and then at her dress. He did not dare to believe it, as though he was not sure if she was a man or a woman. She was clearly a woman, but why did she have short hair? Feng Ling just glanced at him coldly, picked him up, and threw him to the people of the base. This hotel was run by terrorists. After the incident in the private room, all of the terrorists' accomplices either rushed in with guns or hurriedly fled. All of them were pinned down on the spot by the base's people. Not even a fly in the bar could escape. She knew that his arm was injured when he saved her, but now was not the time to care about his injury. She stood there and thought for a moment, looked at the car parked outside, asked a member of the base for the car key, and drove back to the base alone. She had to go back first because her dress had been torn in the fight just now. This dress was too thin. If she returned with Boss Lee in the car, it would be easy for him to notice that something was wrong with her body. For example, her breasts were not silicone at all. Through the rearview mirror, she saw that the bar was getting further and further away from her. She continued to step on the accelerator and quickly left. 5 minutes after Fong Ling left, Li Nanheng came out of the private room and thought of something. He glanced at the people around him but did not see the figure in the white dress. He only saw the long, short hair that fell on the floor of the private room. "Where did Fong Ling go?" he asked coldly. The member of the base standing in the corridor glanced out and replied, "Boss, Fong Ling said that he was not comfortable in that suit. Since there is no problem here, he will go back to the base first." Li Nanheng's hand, which was about to take out a cigarette from his pocket, suddenly paused, and he unconsciously raised his head to look out of the bar. He caught a glimpse of the speeding cars and pedestrians outside the bar. He did not speak immediately. His slender fingers took out a cigarette, lit it, and put it to his mouth. He lowered his eyes, exhaled a mouthful of white smoke, and said coldly, "Why are you in such a hurry to return to the base?" "It's probably because a man wearing a woman's clothes was uncomfortable during the mission. Now that the mission is over, he is in a hurry to go back." The member of the base immediately chuckled. "But speaking of which, Fong Ling's clothes really fit him. I almost believe that he is a real girl." "A real girl?" The man suddenly remembered the feeling on his hand when he pressed Fong Ling against the wall outside the bathroom and kissed her. It was so soft and real that it didn't feel like a pair of fake breasts at all. It even felt a little familiar. It seemed to be the night he broke into Kay's room when he was drunk. He was not sure if it was a dream or a real feeling. But he was sober just now and knew whether it was a dream or real. A man? A woman? At this moment, Li Nanheng's eyes were slightly cold. The operation that might have taken a whole night to complete was successfully completed in the first half of the night, and the members of the base rushed back to the base. Only Li Nanheng's arm was slightly injured. At that time, the bullet passed through the side of his arm. Although it didn't hit inside, it brushed against the side of his arm, leaving a bloodstain more than 1 centimeter deep. When he was in the car, he simply wiped it with gauze. After returning to the base, although he didn't take it seriously, he was still persuaded by the base members to go to the base infirmary to disinfect and bandage it. The car didn't stop after driving into the base. When passing by their residence, Li Nanheng glanced at the light in Fong Ling's room out of the corner of his eye. The car quickly drove past and went straight in the direction of the infirmary. After dealing with the wound in the infirmary, about half an hour later, Li Nanheng returned to his residence. After coming back, Fong Ling took a shower and habitually did balance training before going to bed. Then she was about to open the window to breathe, panting, when she suddenly heard a knock on the door. She paused and turned to look at the door. At the same time, she glanced at the things in the trash can next to her, walked over, and opened the door. The moment she opened the door, the smell of blood on the man's body didn't diminish. Fong Ling, who had washed away the smell of blood and was wearing a large white t-shirt, looked at Li Nanheng, who only had a circle of gauze wrapped around his arm and still hadn't changed his clothes. Even so, the man didn't look the slightest bit disheveled. Instead, his coldness made her heart tremble. "Boss," Fong Ling said respectfully without any change in expression. Li Nanheng looked at her with dark eyes and glanced at her slightly red and swollen lips. His eyes were deep, and he didn't speak but took a step forward. Fong Ling paused, subconsciously moved her hand away from the door, and took a step back, keeping an appropriate distance. The man looked at her coldly. When he took another step forward, she took another step back. Chapter 849. Fong Ling thought she had heard it wrong. She froze and stared at the man in front of her. Huh? Li Nanheng didn't intend to talk nonsense with her at all. "I asked you to take off your clothes, understand?" Fong Ling. "Why?" "A few years ago, the year you came to the base, I went to an orphanage in Los Angeles and found a child dressed as a man, but I didn't see her face at that time, so I don't know who she is. Speaking of this, Lee Nanheng's eyes fell lightly on her body, and his eyes fell on her chest without warning. Even though the man was full of the smell of blood and looked embarrassed, it didn't affect his identity and arrogant aura at all. Any one of his words had an absolute deterrent force and the courage to make others obey him. Hearing him suddenly mention that matter, although Feng Ling wasn't sure, she felt that Boss Lee was beginning to suspect her. In the past, he just didn't have evidence and was not sure, so he didn't particularly insist on digging out the matter that seemed to have nothing to do with him, but at this moment, Boss Lee obviously didn't have any intention of letting her go or giving her a chance. He had to know the truth. "Boss, do you mean that you think I'm the person you met in that orphanage?" Feng Ling looked at him calmly. "How did you find out that she was a woman dressed as a man? Could it be that you took off her clothes? Or did you force me to take off my clothes to prove my identity like what you are doing now?" Feng Ling said this calmly as if the person he was talking about was not her. She didn't even feel anything and just asked him, "Or do you think that the perception of the entire base, including all the drill masters who have been in contact with me, is very low? After living together in the base for so many years, you don't even know whether I am a man or not. Do I need you to force me to take off my clothes to prove myself? I just asked you to take off your clothes. If you are a man, do it. Don't be so shy." Li Nanheng slowly mentioned her usual behavior. "Who in the base have you taken a bath with? Have you been to the public bath in the base? After training for a long time in the summer, all of you brats have taken off your shirts and sweated on the training ground naked. You're the only one who's neatly dressed and hasn't even untied your belt. Plus your height and your usual performance, as the person in charge of the base, I'm qualified to figure this out. It's not too much." Hearing this, Feng Ling immediately smiled. "Boss, you should know that there is a kind of fetish in this world called exhibitionism, and I am the opposite. Exhibitionism is a kind of fetish. I am too cautious and self-defensive like me. Or, I can explain it this way." At this moment, Feng Ling glanced at the trash can by the bed and said mildly, "When I was young, I wandered around without parents. Perhaps because I was born like a girl, with fair and thin skin, I was often bullied by the local American vagrants on the streets. I was even dragged into the alley by a few vagrants and had my clothes stripped off and humiliated on the street. As a result, my personality was shrouded in a layer of shadow. I was wary of everyone and hated to interact with others. I also hated to take off my clothes in front of others." Hearing her explanation, Li Nanheng looked at her deeply and didn't speak, but because of her gaze, he turned his head and looked at the trash can by her bed. In the trash can was the white dress Feng Ling wore on the mission today. The dress was stained with a lot of dirty blood. There was also a pair of high heels, flesh-colored stockings, and a pair of silicone flesh-colored fake breasts. Seeing the pair of silicone things with his own eyes, Li Nanheng's hands in his trouser pocket paused. Feng Ling stood in front of him and watched his boss's eyes gradually turn cold. She raised her arms expressionlessly and made a gesture of letting him take off her clothes at will. "If boss must see it, as you said, we are all men. I won't lose a piece of flesh just by looking at it." The room became abnormally quiet because of Feng Ling's words. Li Nanheng moved his eyes away from the things in the trash can, glanced at her indifferently, and then glanced at her wide t-shirt, open arms, and flat chest. His eyes instantly became much colder, and his low voice was filled with irresistible coldness. "In your eyes, is your boss a psychopath who disregards your psychological shadow and insists on watching you take off your clothes? Or will he give up his goal because of a casual explanation and past? Or, do you think I will believe your reasons?" Feng Ling's eyes were calm. "Boss is boss. The base has given me a place to live. If boss must be serious about this, of course, I won't refuse. As for whether you believe it or not, that's your business." Her eyes were firm and unwavering. For her, it was no longer important whether Boss Lee knew whether she was a man or a woman. What was important was how much he trusted her. After working together for so long and going through fire and water for so many times, gender was not important to her. So what if he was a man? So what if he was a woman? At first, she didn't want to be driven out of the base because she was a woman. Of course, this was also the reason now, but when Xiao Su said that Boss Li liked her, Feng Ling's heart had not calmed down yet. If he insisted on being the person to reveal this secret, she might not refuse. She was only calm. When she finished speaking, her arms were still stretched out. She looked at him calmly and fearlessly. "Boss, do you want to take off your clothes?" How shrewd was Li Nanheng. At this moment, there seemed to be thousands of things reminding him that there was something wrong with Feng Ling. Whether it was her overly reserved performance or the touch he had kissed, if he couldn't tell whether she was a man or a woman, he would have lived in vain for more than 20 years. But Feng Ling's eyes were too calm. The truth was in front of him. Should he reveal it or not? At this moment, Li Nanheng turned his eyes away and looked at all the furnishings on her bed and in her room. Every step was very simple. There were a few books on the table, the bed was neat and clean, and most of the clothes hanging in the cabinet were black or white t-shirts and uniforms. There was nothing feminine. Perhaps it was too cruel to reveal the truth personally. People needed to trust each other, but it also needed honesty. Li Nanheng looked at her again, his eyes slightly cold. "I will only give you this chance. Who are you? Are you a man or a woman? Tell me the truth." Feng Ling did not hesitate. Feng Ling, male. Chapter 850. Feng Ling could clearly feel the changes around her, especially the cold aura emanating from the man in front of her. Looking at Feng Ling's calm expression, Li Nanheng smiled. His thin lips were cold and he ground his teeth hard. "A man?" Feng Ling looked at him without blinking. "Boss, do you really want me to be a woman?" "Not really." He looked at her face expressionlessly and said lightly, "I just need an honest person." Feng Ling's throat seemed to be blocked by something. When she raised her eyes to understand what he meant through his eyes, the man had turned around and said coldly, "If you are a man, remember that you are a man." With that, the man walked out without looking back. Feng Ling froze in place and watched the door close automatically. Why did she feel that Boss Li seemed to know it? But how could he be so sure of her gender? Did she show any flaws today? She had touched the pair of silicone fake breasts just now, which felt soft and elastic. In fact, it was not much different from the real ones. Even if there was a difference, it was impossible for him to completely distinguish the difference under such circumstances. But his eyes just now, late at night, Feng Ling lay on the bed. She should have fallen asleep, but she had insomnia. Li Nanheng's words kept echoing in her mind. "I just need an honest person." She even remembered the scene in the bar of terrorists, when Li Nanheng rushed into the crowd to hold the person who was almost shot in his arms and quickly turned around to block the bullet for her. She remembered the white gauze on his arm. After closing her eyes for about half an hour, she suddenly opened her eyes again. In the blink of an eye, it was already very late, and the entire 11 base was already silent. But she couldn't sleep. Those voices and scenes kept repeating in her mind. She suddenly sat up, picked up the cushion for balance training, and lay on the ground. After about 15 minutes, her forehead was already sweating. She took 2 deep breaths, sat on the cushion, and stared at the night sky outside the balcony in a daze. Balance training was very easy to sweat. After only 15 minutes of training, her body was already wet and sticky. She looked outside until her neck was a little stiff. She got up and went into the bathroom to take a simple shower. After showering, she didn't rush to wrap her chest. She just stood in front of the full-length mirror in the bathroom and looked at the naked girl in the mirror. She stared at her lips, which still felt a little numb, and then looked down at her well-proportioned and perfect body. She didn't know what kind of body was considered a good body among girls. She only knew that when she wore women's clothes last time and today, she seemed to look good indeed. Even if she wore long hair or short hair, it didn't affect the thick and almost unconcealable girlish feeling. Was it because of this that Li Nanheng no longer believed her words? Did she really expose her secret so easily? But looking at his attitude, he didn't know what was going on. Did he really know? Or is it just a guess? Feng Ling didn't understand a lot of things, and she didn't even know what love was. She had never been aware of gender since she was a child. After being a man for a long time, she had never thought about being a woman and didn't seem to feel that being a woman had any other meaning. So when Li Nanheng asked her, she still answered that she was a man. But when Li Nanheng turned to leave, his eyes were piercingly cold, which made her feel uneasy. She didn't know what kind of feeling it was. She only knew that she couldn't sleep. The next day, it was a routine training at the base. In the training ground of the sniper team, 5 people stood in a row and were doing physical training. Xiao Fei watched them do the exercises one by one and sternly demanded that everyone must reach the standard within an hour. It rained yesterday, but today it was sunny. It was probably the last hot weather before autumn. Under the sunlight, Li Nanheng's figure appeared on the training ground. Usually, Boss Li would come over occasionally to watch them train, so everyone was used to it. They shouted "Boss" in unison and continued to do the exercises seriously. Feng Ling glanced at Li Nanheng, but the man's eyes did not fall on her. He just stood there coldly and indifferently watching them train without speaking. The black uniform was very loose, and she couldn't see anything on his arm, but Feng Ling knew that the gauze on his arm should be wrapped inside and covered by his clothes. She didn't know how serious the injury was. Last night, she came back early and didn't go to the infirmary with him. She could only see that Boss Li's expression didn't seem to be wrong and felt that it shouldn't be too serious, but yesterday, the sound of the bullet grazing his flesh was very clear. She stared at the man's arm. When Xiao Fei asked them to do the second exercise, her movements slowed for a moment. Xiao Fei's eyes suddenly turned to her. Feng Ling? Feng Ling came back to herself, stood up abruptly, and turned to continue with the others with a solemn expression. She didn't look in that direction again. Xiao Fei turned to look at Li Nanheng. Seeing that Boss Li looked as usual, he thought for a while and didn't say anything. He walked forward and continued to lead them to do exercises. When he came behind Feng Ling, he raised her stretched arm and whispered, "Why do you look so pale? You are not in a good state today." Feng Ling's eyes remained serious and she replied in a low voice, "I didn't sleep well last night." Xiao Fei glanced at her again. Sure enough, there were a little dark circles under her eyes, but not very serious. It could be seen that Feng Ling, who never stayed up late, almost didn't sleep last night. Seeing her listless but determined look, Xiao Fei turned to walk to the others. After about 10 minutes, he said, "All right, take a break for half an hour. We'll continue after half an hour." Kay looked surprised. "Didn't you say that we must reach the standard posture within an hour? How long has it been since the morning training started? Is it the new year or something good? When did the training time arrangement in the base become so humane?" Xiao Fei squinted at him. "If you don't want to rest, you can continue to practice. I'll check your performance in an hour." Kay immediately put down his stretched arm. "No, I said I'll rest. Brother Xiao, you can't go back on your word." Xiao Fei glanced at him again and then looked at Feng Ling. Hearing that she was going to rest, he saw that she had put down her arm, turned around, and walked to the bench that was usually used to rest and sit down. Chapter 851. Xiao Fei paused and was about to speak, but Li Nanheng had already walked over without looking back. Feng Ling was sitting on the chair to rest and wanted to close her eyes for a while. However, as soon as she closed her eyes, she suddenly felt a heavy pressure in front of her. She suddenly opened her eyes and looked up to see the person who caused her to lose sleep for a whole night. Li Nanheng put one hand in his trouser pocket and lowered his eyes. His eyes were pitch black, and his healthy skin color appeared much whiter under the blazing sun. He looked like a vampire aristocrat under the sun. Especially when he stood with his back to the light, his indifferent and lazy aura was even more prominent. Didn't you say that your physical fitness is up to standard? How long has it been since morning training? Why are you so tired that you need to sit here and sleep? Hearing his words, the fatigue in Feng Ling's eyes disappeared in an instant. She didn't want to mention that she didn't sleep well last night and just said, Drill Master Qiao said to let me rest. I just sit here for a while and take advantage of the limited time to replenish my strength. Li Nanheng's eyes were slightly cold. Get up. Feng Ling stood up. Continue to practice. Feng Ling glanced at the other 4 people who were resting and then at the empty training ground. Deputy Drill Master Qiao said, Is Qiao Fei the boss or am I the boss? The moment the man heard the words Deputy Drill Master Qiao, his eyes burst into coldness. Feng Ling felt as though the hot air above her head had turned cold at this moment. She raised her eyes to look at him, but the man's gaze shifted away and did not land on her. However, it was clear that his order for her to continue practicing was effective. Feng Ling was silent for a moment and didn't say more. She turned back to the middle of the training ground and continued to practice alone. Qiao Fei turned to get a bottle of mineral water and came back. When he turned his head, he saw that Feng Ling suddenly went to practice again. He was surprised and asked from a distance, Didn't I say to let you rest for half an hour? Why are you practicing alone? Feng Ling didn't answer, and Qiao Fei felt something was wrong. Then he turned to see Boss Li standing not far from her with his arms crossed and expressionlessly watching her practice. At this time, Tam also leaned over to Kay and whispered, What happened? Did Feng Ling offend Boss Li? Kay didn't understand. He looked at Feng Ling and then at Boss Li whose head was engraved with the words, Don't mess with me today, and sighed. I don't know. Of course he didn't know. He clearly remembered that Boss was very kind to Feng Ling, but why did he seem to be against her today? Kay suddenly didn't quite understand the relationship between men. After all, Boss was present, and it was clearly an order from Boss, so Qiao Fei couldn't say anything. He could only walk over and take a look before saying, Stop practicing for now. Come drink some water. As he spoke, he turned to hand the other bottles of water to the other 4 people and then to Boss Li, thinking that he would give it to Feng Ling and let her rest for a while. However, when the bottle was handed to Nanheng, he phased. To Li at Ling up to him. Up. To Li up. Nanheng, Ling, to Boss Fei, Li, Qi, Ling, to him, to, he, at, of Fei. Feng Ling raised his eyebrows and didn't feel embarrassed. He took back the water, played with it casually in his hand, and said, Feng Ling, come here and drink some water. Feng Ling let out a long breath. Okay, she continued. Seeing that Boss's face was as cold as frost, Feng Ling didn't seem to be in a good state, but she didn't say anything. She didn't say anything even if she was tired, thirsty, or hot. She just stood there and continued to practice. Half an hour later, the rest time passed, and the other 4 people returned to the field, but Feng Ling was still not allowed to stop. The morning passed, and it was nearly 11 o'clock. They had practiced for several hours. The others had taken a break in the middle, but Feng Ling, who was in the worst state, didn't even take a break and had been practicing until now. Qiao Fei didn't know what to say at first, but seeing the scorching sun, he couldn't help turning to Li Nanheng and saying, Boss, it's almost noon. Let them take a break and go have lunch. Otherwise, it's autumn. If they get a heatstroke, it's really not good. Do you think 11 Base is a resort? If they're tired, they can rest. If they're hungry, they can eat. If they're sweating, do you want me to arrange for them to soak in a hot spring? The noble and handsome face on Li Nanheng's face seemed to be broken under the scorching sun, leaving only a sense of oppression that made people feel uneasy and cold. But Feng Ling. Is there something special about him, so special that you need to take care of him? Li Nanheng's eyes fell on his face, and his voice sounded light and light. His voice was so low that only Xiao Fei could hear it. Or, do you know something? His voice was very low, but when Xiao Fei looked into his eyes were full of coldness. Know what? Boss, it's very basic to care about the members of the sniper team. Li Nanheng suddenly smiled, but his eyes were cold. I've warned you more than once. Put away your excessive care. 11 base doesn't need trash. Feng Ling has performed very well in all kinds of tasks, big or small, and his physical fitness is much better than when he first entered the base. How could he be trash? He's even better than many newcomers who entered the base at the same time. I'm sure I'm not the only one who emphasized this matter. When Li Nanheng turned around expressionlessly, Xiao Fei took a step forward and stood in front of him. Also, what do you mean by, I know something? Is there something that Feng Ling can't tell others? Or is there something that I don't know that needs boss to specially remind me? Li Nanheng looked indifferent and pushed his shoulder away. You'd better not know. With that, he turned and walked out of the training ground. Xiao Fei looked at his back calmly, suppressed his temper, and asked again, let them go to the canteen to rest before 12 o'clock, okay? The man did not answer. His back was as cold as the snow on the top of the mountain, and his footsteps were already far away. Xiao Fei withdrew his gaze, turned his eyes to Feng Ling who was still insisting on training, and sighed. What happened? This last couldn't have been discovered by boss, right? Half an hour later, at 12 o'clock, Xiao Fei let them go to rest first and then go to the canteen for lunch. When they arrived at the base's canteen, Feng Ling's head was buzzing because she didn't sleep well last night and had a whole morning of intensive training. Xiao Fei saw that she was not in a good state even when she was holding the plate, so he asked her to sit down first and helped her to scoop the rice. Not long after, he placed her plate full of food in front of her. Feng Ling raised her eyes to say thank you, and from the corner of her eyes, she suddenly saw a car quickly driving past outside the canteen. Dash. Chapter 852. That car was red, which she had never seen in the base, and it didn't seem to be a car of the base. She just glanced out and didn't have the energy to pay attention to it. She picked up the chopsticks and began to eat. At this time, several members of the base who were eating lunch were whispering, "Is Dr. Wen's sister here again?" The other brothers didn't say anything. They just smiled at the car that had gone far away. Then, they looked at each other, as if they were gossiping. Feng Ling glanced in their direction. Dr. Wen was the resident doctor in the infirmary of the base. It was Dr. Wen who examined her when she fainted and her leg was injured. He was a very gentle and fair-skinned male doctor in his 30s. People who could work in 11 base for a long time were not ordinary people. It was said that Dr. Wen's family had some relations with the military in the United States, and he had brothers and sisters, but she seldom went to the infirmary. The base was also full of men, so she didn't know much about other people's families. Feng Ling lowered her head and focused on eating because she had a hunch that such intensive training would not stop in a short time. After eating, she left the cafeteria and didn't feel any changes in the base because of Dr. Wen's sister's visit. She went straight back to the training ground. There wasn't much training time this afternoon, so she could go back to her residence in 2 hours. However, when Feng Ling was about to go back, she received a notice to return to the training ground to continue training. This notice was called by another drill master of the sniper team. Xiao Fei didn't know it, and Li Nanheng didn't come in person. Feng Ling took the phone call and knew that her hunch was right, but she didn't know how she offended Boss Li. When she returned to the training ground, she saw Boss Li standing there. The devil training in the past came to her mind again. This time, Feng Ling was mentally prepared. She stood behind the man. Boss. Li Nanheng looked back and glanced at her. Yes. It felt as if she was greeting the Grim Reaper, and the Grim Reaper knew that she was well aware of it. She didn't even need to explain. She only needed to greet her calmly. "Boss, I know I'm not in a good state this morning, and the new movements I learned are not very good." Feng Ling said, "Thank you, boss, for wasting your time to train me alone." Li Nanheng's expression didn't change. He nodded indifferently. N. He turned around and gave her the middle seat. When he turned around again, the man glanced at the clothes she was still wearing. Understanding his gaze, Feng Ling explained, "I guess that because of my poor performance today, boss would call me out. Anyway, I'll still sweat. There's no need to change my clothes before coming over." On one hand, there was the smell of sweat on her body, so she probably didn't want to get close to her as much as when she was wearing women's clothes yesterday. Boss would probably dislike her and wouldn't get too close to her. On the other hand, she had this premonition, so she was too lazy to change her clothes. This was quite good. At least because of boss's misophobia, she could maintain an appropriate distance. Regardless of whether he had guessed something or not, it was better to stay as far away from him as possible. As if he understood her purpose at a glance, Li Nanheng stood on the edge of the training ground, his long legs still, his left hand in his trouser pocket, and his deep eyes fell on her cautious and calm face. "First, do balance exercises for an hour, then do 100 push-ups. After that, we'll continue with the other physical events." As Li Nanheng spoke, his black military boots ruthlessly stepped over the white line on the edge of the training ground and retreated to the side of the bench. The sun was blazing in the afternoon. Feng Ling had just experienced a hair-raising disguise in the bar yesterday. She hadn't slept all night and had undergone a whole morning of intensive training. Right now, she wasn't sure if she could maintain her balance for an hour. However, seeing boss's expression, she still silently followed his instructions. Seeing that the boy didn't say anything and just lay in the middle of the training ground silently as always, Li Nanheng's eyes were slightly cold and he looked down at the boy who was lying on his stomach and then half propped up with his arms. At this time, Han Jin and Xiao Su passed by the sniper team's training ground. Seeing that there were people inside, they subconsciously looked in this direction. What the hell? What was going on? Why did boss give Feng Ling intensive training again? Didn't they just fight with terrorists yesterday? Under normal circumstances, after completing a dangerous mission, the members of the base should have at least 2 or 3 days of vacation. Why didn't Feng Ling give them a vacation today, but he was also given intensive training? Li Nanheng suddenly took off the black uniform draped over his back, threw it on the bench, and glanced outside. Xiao Su and Han Jin, who were talking, immediately fell silent. Feng Ling also raised his head and looked in their direction. With a pa sound, the silver lighter in Li Nanheng's hand flashed slightly, and the man lit a cigarette without any change in his expression. "What are you looking at? Go on." His voice was very light, but with an absolute tone of command, and he threw another word to the 2 people outside. Even though it was so far away that they could only see his lips, they could see that Boss Li's indifferent and cold words were, "Get lost." Han Jin and Xiao Su immediately walked away quickly, but from time to time, they looked back at Feng Ling who was undergoing intensive training. Didn't he sacrifice himself to disguise as a woman to help boss carry out the mission yesterday? Did something go wrong in the middle? He was fine before, but as soon as he came back, he was targeted by our cold-faced boss. Alas, why do I suddenly feel that Feng Ling is the most miserable person in our base? He is so pitiful, Xiao Su said in a low voice after walking away. Han Jin chuckled. How is he miserable? Every time Feng Ling receives a mission bonus, he doesn't get it himself, does he? He is stopped by boss. And the vacation he should get after the mission is over, boss didn't give him and even forced him to participate in the devil training. This is simply extortion. Yesterday, Feng Ling risked his life. Chapter 853. Xiao Su also knew these things, but he still felt that Boss Li seemed to be a bit too cruel to Feng Ling. Xiao Su didn't know what Feng Ling looked like after putting on the women's clothes yesterday, because Feng Ling drove out after changing her clothes yesterday. Was it because Boss was stimulated by Feng Ling wearing women's clothes? Xiao Su looked back at the training ground that was getting farther and farther away. From a distance, he saw Boss Li throw the cigarette butt under his feet and stamp it out. Even if Boss didn't look in this direction, from this angle, he felt that his gaze was a bit breathless. TSK, Feng Ling, why did you suddenly make Boss angry? You were still Boss's little baby not long ago. It was from afternoon to 8:00 at night. When it was dinner time, Li Nanheng didn't ask her to stop training. Li Nanheng didn't go to eat but just stood aside. In the past few hours, more than a dozen cigarette butts had been piled under his feet. Seeing that Feng Ling's physical strength had reached the extreme, she insisted on remaining silent and would rather resign herself to the adversity than explain, or even say a word more. His eyes became more and more gloomy and terrifying. At 9:00, the people in the base had gone back to rest, and only the two of them were here. Li Nanheng's voice made her heart tremble. You sweat so much. Are you tired? Feng Ling's hands were firmly on the ground. This was the second time she had tried to balance her limbs in the past few hours. She was motionless, but sweat slowly dripped down her cheeks, nose, neck, and slowly fell to the ground, leaving a trace of sweat on the ground, and then was blown away by the wind a few seconds later. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and insisted, I'm not tired. She was still very stubborn. Li Nanheng looked at her coldly and suddenly chuckled. He then walked up to her and reached out to pull her up from the ground. Feng Ling was already exhausted. When she was pulled up like this, she almost bumped into the man's arms. She raised her eyes and met the man's cold, dark eyes. She heard the man say coldly, 11 base has always eliminated those who are good at lying. This punishment is already light. Don't just sweat. Think about what you did wrong. Feng Ling's legs were weak and she struggled to stand up. Her collar was still held in the man's hand. She took a breath and said hoarsely, lie? Is Boss dissatisfied with one of my missions, or is he dissatisfied with one of my tests? I don't need to say that I'm loyal to the base. All my actions can prove my sincerity. Yet, Boss, you're using the title of a liar on my head? Li Nanheng sneered. So, do you think you are an honest person? Feng Ling looked at him. The back of her collar was tugged tightly. She was struggling to breathe, but she did not speak. Seeing that she was unwilling to speak, Li Nanheng suddenly let go of her collar. Caught off guard, she suddenly staggered and fell to the ground. Her knees also fell hard on the ground, but at the moment when the pain came, she gritted her teeth and did not make a sound. She supported herself with her hands on the ground, looked at the sweat dripping from her nose to the ground, closed her eyes, and took a few deep breaths. Stand up. Li Nanheng put one hand in his trouser pocket and looked down at her. His voice was extremely cold. Act like a man. Stand up. The man said the last 3 words very harshly. His harshness was filled with ruthlessness and anger that even he did not understand. He only coldly watched as she slowly staggered to her feet and then stood in front of him weakly. Her face was already a little pale, but she still refused to admit defeat. She did not even want to beg or tell the truth. Can you continue? He asked. Feng Ling looked up at him and raised her hand to wipe her sweat. Yes. Then do it. With that, Li Nanheng threw her to the ground. The 3 cold words made Feng Ling's eyes tremble. She felt that Boss Li should have guessed it. Perhaps he just needed the last confirmation. Seeing that the man's back had gone far away, she slowly bent down and continued to maintain the balance of her limbs. She did not stop because of the man's departure. The story she made up in front of him last night was not completely false. Although she was not stripped naked by a homeless man on the street, when she was 8 years old, she was targeted by several people who wanted to stop her and drag her back to their room. She escaped several times. Later, someone told her to cut her hair short, think of herself as a man, and smear all kinds of dirty black gasoline on her face. Only in this way could she keep herself safe in that group of outlaws. Otherwise, a little girl like her who was brought out of a wolf's den without parents and no one to rely on would be swallowed alive by those perverts at any time. Then she did as she was told. Only by being a man could she have the most basic sense of security. After another 2 hours, 11 base had fallen into the silence of the night. When Li Nanheng walked back to the training ground, he saw that Feng Ling, who had been persisting in the intensive training, suddenly lay on the ground because of exhaustion. At the moment she lay down, she might want to rest for a while, but after hesitating for a few seconds, she continued to support her arms and insisted on doing it. He walked in. Hearing the footsteps, Feng Ling's face was dripping with sweat. She raised her head and looked at the man not far away. It was as though she was so stubborn that she didn't trust anyone except herself. It was as though she only wanted to stick to herself. It was as though she wouldn't beg for mercy no matter how painful it was. This made Li Nanheng so angry that even his arm, which had just been changed, was faintly aching. He walked over and looked at the boy who insisted on supporting herself with her hands on the ground. "Can you still hold on?" Feng Ling did not hesitate. "Yes." Seeing that her hands and arms on the ground were trembling, Li Nanheng didn't say more but just stood by and watched how long she could hold on. However, Feng Ling lay down several times, stubbornly continued to support herself, lay down, and support herself again. After repeating this for a long time, her clothes had been soaked with sweat, and the ground under her was also covered with sweat. At 12:00 in the evening, Li Nanheng looked at the time and said, "It's 12 o'clock." Feng Ling didn't say anything. He looked at her coldly. "You practice, and I'll go to sleep." Feng Ling said, "Okay." You're tuning into the Romantic Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.